Thank you for listening to this CD. I'm Jerry Meringue, part of the Jerry and Donna Hunting and Fishing Adventure stories. They take place mostly in Alaska, but also occur in Montana and Washington State. I have attempted to be as factual as possible. I have contacted wherever possible all names mentioned in the text. All responses were positive. I have culled 5 or 6 of these stories due to the lack of validation or the fact perhaps they were a little dicey and their inclusion may negatively affect my legitimacy. I hope not. Okay, let's do this thing. This is Jerry, and this is a story of a 1978 Brooks Range trip of 31 days. We'd been in Fairbanks 1 year only, and we were already recognized that if we were going to test the wilderness, the Brooks Range is a place to go because it is the wildest and most remote. But I didn't know how to get there. So I had a counselor friend of mine that happened to know a guide by the name of Chuck Gray, who was an old wolf hunter, and he guided in the Brooks Range. In fact, at that time, he was probably the only guide in the Brooks Range. So we cut a deal with him, and he flew us up the Koyukuk River and to a place called Apoon Mountain. I knew that mountain well because I was a real fierce advocate of Bob Marshall, who was the only white man that had ever been up there. And he had been on Apoon Mountain, and it was really lucky that that's where we ended up. But anyway, we were so far north that if we got to the top of Apoon, we could look down on the north slope. So we were as far north in the Brooks Range as you can go. Anyway, that tells you where we're at. He dropped us off on a gravel bar and said he'd be back in 31 days to pick us up. So the next day, all bigger, we grabbed our packs and guns and started walking upriver. You get about a mile past our camp and you are above the timberline, so it's just tundra, muskegs, and some willows along the river. We got down to the bottom of Apoon, looked up, and saw something white. Well, I'd never seen a Dall sheep before, so hell, I knew they were white, but that's all. Well, polar bears are white too. For all I know, it could have been a polar bear, which of course would have been ridiculous. Anyway, we started up the mountain and we walked some ridges to stay out of sight of that white spot. Then when we got there, he was within shooting range, and this was Donna's shot. She made the shot and the ram folded up. Our first ram down. We were so excited we sat there and went ahead to my normal boisterous self-quoted poem of what drives a hunter onward ever forward and all that stuff. About that time I looked up and there's another ram that stuck his head over the hill to see what the commotion was about. That turned out to be a big full curl or beyond. So I didn't waste any time. Bam, down he goes. So we had our first day out and we had our Dall rams on the ground. So I went up, dressed them, caped them, cut their horns off, packed them, and cut off as much meat as both of us as we could, the tenderloins and the good meat, and still be able to pack them out because we already had the horns and capes, but we had quite a bit of meat also. We loaded our packs heavy as we could because hell, it was all downhill from there. And down we went. Of course, we didn't care about the darkness like we do hunting up here because it's light all the time. We just hammered down the mountain, got to the bottom, and started following the river down to our camps, which was about 3 miles below where we were at. Now, at that point is where it gets interesting. At that point, we're walking through some willows right on the edge of a side track of the river. Kind of a little side channel, and walking through the willows right on the edge of the side channel of the river. And one or both of us looked down at a big flat rock. It was a hot afternoon, by the way, a big flat rock, and on that flat rock was a great big grizzly bear paw. Now it was damn fresh because while we were looking at it, it mostly evaporated away. So I knew we were within actually yards or feet of that bear, and it was walking in the same direction we were. So we locked and loaded both of our cannons, filled them up with big magnums, and 3 rounds each, and started slithering through the willows, and we got to the end of it. We broke through the willows, and there he was, standing right in the middle of this side channel. Yeah, anyway, hell, I wanted to kill a grizzly bear, so I blasted, and down he went. I mean, he went down, and he bounced right back up like he was on a pogo stick. Donna hammered him. Down he went, back up like a pogo stick. Bam, I gave him my second shot. Again, he bounced. I mean, just bounced back up. Donna hammered him again, and that was enough. He went down and got back up, but it didn't bounce. He got back up struggling in an attempt to run through the rest of the water up about a 6-foot bank headed for the main river, and at that point, I put the last round through the back of his head and killed him. Anyway, we stood shoulder to shoulder, guns smoking. Bear was roaring, and bear was coming, but by God, we put him down. Now I'll tell you this, it was the first grizzly bear I had ever hunted, and I know that neither one of us had faltered, or one of us would have been alone. We didn't have enough gunpowder to save our lives, and that's a fact. Anyway, we went over and found the first big black spruce tree up there. And even though it was a skinny little thing, we went over to it and hung our packs up as high as we could, rope to this small tree. Went over and scanned the bear. I mean, I wanted to look at it. So anyway, we just skinned it, bundled it up, and packed it back. Went back to camp, spread the grizzly bear out on a great big rock right below our camp on the river. The next morning, we went back, got our packs and our meat and our horns, and we set up back to camp. We cooked sheep meat until we both bloated. That's when Donna stole my first Carmelo bar from me while I was behind the tent. She stole the damn candy bar of mine for dessert. But that's a lie. I stole hers, actually. But anyway, the next morning, we took what prime meat we had, fresh to the side, and put it in the permafrost under the moss, and then the rest of it we sliced up and built a drying rack and a smoke fire, and we dried all the rest of the sheep meat into jerky, into semi-smoked jerky. So that was how we spent the next day. So we kind of spent the next couple days roaming around and making up our camp a little more comfortable, and partying with dry sheep meat and food that we had brought. And then we went down to the gravel bar that Chuck had dropped us off on, and it had a lot of big rocks on it. So we spent about 3 days clearing the big rocks off and making for a smooth and usable landing strip. Anyway, we just kind of camped around for a while and roamed the hills, and then it leads me to my next section of this odyssey, of this journey. Because next I want to go into where we ran out of meat, and we're getting hungry. So, ready to go for any kind of food, and that's when we started stealing candy bars from each other. It's the next part of my story. But a little background first. So we were 1 week into it, and how much more do you kill on this trip? Let's at least take a couple weeks into it, and I've heard this story a lot. I'm going to fully utilize this country, but I'm going to be a real Alaskan hunter. I can't be hiring people to take me out, even though this was actually the cost. The cost of this was the whole thing about flying, and we got it all for about $220. But actually, I wanted to do it on my own. So as soon as we got back, I started taking flying lessons, and I'll tell a little story. This is a sideline. I hired a pilot who was supposed to be the best pilot of all. The only person who ever flown a single-engine aircraft across the Arctic, over the North Pole from Fairbanks to Norway and back again. I wanted the best, so I hired him. I bought a little plane with a dentist friend of mine, Jeff Copeland, and we bought a little PA-20, which turned out to be a worthless airplane, but anyway, it was giving me lessons. I was about halfway there through my lessons with my pilot friend and where I could go solo. He was chartered to fly Senator Boggs, who was the Maine senator in Washington, D.C., and Mark Begich, who was a senator for Alaska. And they used to fly these two guys from Fairbanks to Juneau to a meeting. They were never heard from again, and of course this was the biggest air search ever to happen on the planet to find those guys, because they were the most important people. And you can, second and third most important people actually in the whole country. They had every Air Force, Navy, and everything they could search for those guys, and they never did find them. So it was estimated they flew into a glacier, either into a crevice or they flew into a glacier and crashed, and then snow covered them up, because the airplane they were looking for had ultraviolet heat sensors and everything at that time. But it could have been about 1979. And they're still missing. So I went and I had to get a new instructor. So I got a guy who had just come back from Vietnam, and his job there had been flying a gun platform helicopter, and he had a lot of experience flying. Anyway, I finished my license with him. I don't remember his name now, but he was a tough dude. He had a clipboard, and if I did something wrong, he hit me right alongside the head with it. And I learned real quick not to do that same thing again. But anyway, that trip stimulated me to get a pilot's license and then buy an airplane with Jeff Copeland. And then it went from there. I just kept getting better planes and better planes. So that's my airplane story. Now I'm going to have to shift gears, because we're going to talk about the second half of the Brooks Range trip. Clear? Well, the second half is 3 weeks long. Now, moose. We were hunting Dall sheep and grizzly bears, and that's where we left it. In the past 2 weeks, we've been taking care of meat, flushing hides, taking care of hides, drying meat, cleaning the place up for Chuck Gray to land his yellow super cub when he comes back, which was quite a job, and kind of keeping our eyes open for wolves. We were kind of hunting wolves, but we hadn't seen any. At any rate, we were out of fresh meat. We'd been out of fresh meat for several days, and we eyeballed a cow and calf moose on a muskeg area with a few scattered trees on it, right across the river, about a half a mile. We've been watching them and decided, hey, okay, there's some fresh meat. Let's go take that calf and we'll butcher it and bring it back here, dry it, and it'll get us through the rest of the trip. We geared up, got our guns, headed across the river, which wasn't any big deal. You just had to take your boots off and wade about up to your thighs. We put our boots back on and headed up. And the moose calf, it took about a half an hour to get up. The moose calf was laying down, so I snuck up a little bit, got within probably, 30, 40 yards from it, and cut off to the side. Donna cut off to the side like we always do. We always cover each other's back when it's going to be a shooter. So she was going to kind of watch my back. I snuck up a little bit further, rested on a tree, and shot it in the head. I thought I did anyway. It rolled over and started bleeding like a damn sheep. So I ran up as quick as I could, laid my gun against a tree, a little sapling, grabbed it by the nose, and got my knife out and went cutting on its throat. I got it pretty well cut when I heard a thump, 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 thump. And actually, it was muskeg, so you know it's just real soft, and I could actually feel the ground shaking. I looked over to my left, and here come a giant cow moose headed straight for me. And she was probably, 30 yards away, quite a ways. And I had plenty of time to get my gun and shoot her, because it was obvious what she's going to do. She's going to drive me into the dirt and the muskeg with her front feet. For the first time in my life, I've been hunting pretty tough animals all my life, and as I said earlier, I stood elbow to elbow and took on a raging grizzly bear that could have killed either one of us, only one of us had been shooting, and I froze. And I didn't reach for my gun at all. I was down on my knees watching this moose, and I couldn't move a muscle. I mean, I couldn't believe what was happening to me. I'd never had it happen before, and never had it happen since, but I froze. I locked up. I looked up in sheer panic. The moose was bearing down on my ass hard. And about this time, boom, I heard that .350 Magnum of hers go off, and she hit it right up in the hump, which is where our backbone is. The moose dropped, but its momentum slid it across the muskeg until its nose actually touched the calf moose that I just killed. Needless to say, once again, my wife had saved my life, and this was absolutely no BS. And that is why and why would I tell a lie about me being a coward and having my wife shoot something off my back? But that's the way it was. Well, I tell you, we had moose meat now, more than we can use. We butchered. Once I got my senses, which took a while, and probably threw up. I don't remember that. We butchered the calf, took most of it, and took the back straps off the cow, put in our packs, and headed back to camp. Our goal was not to waste meat. That was never a thought. I had no intention of killing that cow moose. Obviously, I didn't, because I didn't kill it. We thought, okay, well, at least we'll get it used up. It will get used up because wolves or a grizzly bear will find it. And we're sitting in a camp where we can see it with a spotting scope easily and watch. Once the wolves show up, well, we'll do some wolf hunting. At any rate, we stumbled back to camp, crossed the river again in our little knoll where our camp was, and started drying meat. Got a larger drying rack, got smoke fire going, and started peeling strips and cooking prime cuts off the calf. We were there about a week, playing with the meat and giggling and having fun and watching a hillside looking for wolves, which never did show up, at least during the daytime. They may have come at night, and hell, they may have been working on it, but I don't think so, because wolves aren't like that. When they get on some meat, they sit on it until it's gone, day or night. But anyway, I'm sure that a grizzly or wolves found the meat, and it was disposed of according to nature. One day, a couple days after that, I heard the super cub, and in came Chuck Gray and picked up Donna and what load he could take. He was back in about 2 hours, picked me up, and took us back to Chandler Lake, where Dick Burley, his partner, was waiting with a 170. He had a 170 and loaded everything in the 170 at Chandler Strip and flew us back to Fairbanks. And that brings us to the end of the Brooks Range, grizzly bear, Dall sheep, and moose odyssey. We thrived over that story for a long time, and still do. It was the best month that anyone could have spent in total. One thing I didn't mention was that the mountain that we took the sheep on, and we were the first white men on, we were not the first white men on that mountain. And I asked Chuck Gray to put us in the best of his knowledge, the most knowledgeable person in the Brooks Range that there was at the time, to put us where there was no white man. Well, I had read both Bob Marshall's books, and one of them, his partner, who I don't recall his name, had been on the top of Apoon, and that is where we got our sheep. It is just a little sidebar that I thought was of some interest. And that man walked there from Wiseman up the Koyukuk River for about 25 miles or more to get to the top of Apoon. So more about Bob Marshall later. That's the end of my story now, and I hope you enjoyed it. This is going to be the next chapter in the Alaska Wildlife Odyssey of Jerry and Donna Meringue. This particular chapter just involves Jerry, as Donna was no longer on the trip. The trip involves polar bear hunting and muskox adventure. The muskox adventure was just kind of happened. It wasn't part of the plan, but it did happen, and you'll get that story too. At any rate, in 1969, I arranged a polar bear hunt with Chuck Gray and Dick Burley, and we ended up in Kaktovik, which is a village, an Eskimo village on Barter Island, at the end of the Alaska North Sea. Kaktovik or Barter Island is about 20 miles north slope north of the north slope of the Brooks Range and about 50 miles west of the border with Canada and the Northwest Territories. It also happens to be a dew line site, which the American military has set up missiles to determine any Russian advances over the Arctic. But that's neither here nor there. This was a village of pure Eskimos, and the missile range was separate from that. At any rate, it's all on Barter Island, and we took off about 3 days after my arrival, waiting for good weather in February, so the days are short, so you have to be on the ball if you're going to get out on the ice. If you have good weather, and we finally got it. So we took toward the Arctic Ocean from Kaktovik, what's called anchor ice. The Arctic Ocean close to the shore is very shallow, and it freezes solid for about a mile or two out. At that point, it meets the pack ice, which is constantly ebbing and flowing, most of it toward the east, where the pack ice meets the anchor ice. It crushes into it and leaves a hard and very large pressure ridge. At any rate, we flew over the anchor ice because we needed to get out on the pack ice, the possibility of finding bears. Now, the pack ice continually moves, and it leaves big openings, fissures in the ice of open water. And then when water freezes, and it leaves a crusty, frosty coating on the surface, and these frozen over leads are what we're searching for, looking for polar bear tracks. You couldn't see it on the ice itself because it just didn't work. When we located a track that we thought had possibilities, that it was a single animal and not having cubs, we would land and measure the front feet. If the front feet were over 8 inches, then it was about an 8-foot bear. Every inch of the front foot was about 1 foot in the length of a polar bear. An 8-foot paw would be an 8-foot polar bear. A 10-foot paw would be a 10-foot polar bear. So we searched up and down the leads over and until we could track sites, and we found one that was over 8 inches, and down we went. We tracked that bear tracks until we found the bear. At this point, one plane stayed aloft for safety purposes. The other plane landed between pressure ridges on the pack ice, obscured from the bear, then way ahead of the bear. And then we laid behind the ice floes and waited for the bear to approach. When the bear showed himself, I opened up and took my first polar bear. There were more to come later, but that was my first. The second plane landed with Dick Burley and Ned Newson-Ginya, an Eskimo from Barter Island and other places in the Arctic, because they took him along as a survival instrument, really. If we got in real trouble, then we would rely on him to get us through, and in between the four of us, we skinned the bear. Newson-Ginya took selected cuts from the bear, as much as we could carry in the 2 super cubs, and we headed back to Kaktovik on Barter Island. At this point, Ned took the polar bear hide over to 2 Eskimos who chopped a hole in the lagoon next to Barter Island, next to the sea ice. They tied a rope around the bear's nose, dipped him down into the water many times, up and down, and trying to remove the blood. When they pulled the hide up, stomped into the snow, stuck it back in the water again several times, and finally they pulled the bear hide out, hung it over a long rope, and beat it with shovels to beat the water and snow off of it. And it came back. When they were done, it was pure white. So they took the hide back to the village where Ned Newson-Ginya's wife, Faye Newson-Ginya, we'll talk about later, an unbelievable Eskimo woman, and 2 other Eskimo women used their ulus to flesh the hide and get all the fat and flesh off it. Turned the nose, eyelids, lips. It took many hours to do this. Then they salted it down and packed it ready for my transport back. We had a big party that night. We opened up 4 cans of beans instead of 3. The next day, Chuck Gray told me that there was going to be a plane coming in to the Dew Line site, which is the missile base, and it was going to contain 16 muskox, which was being brought in by the National Guard freight plane from Nunivak Island. Nunivak is an island off the west coast of Alaska, about 100 miles south of Nome. Back in the old days, there were muskox on the north slope. When the whalers came, they found that they could get fresh, easy meat from the muskox, so they traveled inland on the muskox when in danger. Wolves were bare at that time, mainly wolves, was to form a circle with the bulls outward and the calves and cows inward. They would fend off any danger, but with muskets of the whalers, there was no challenge. And they actually, over the years, wiped the muskox out completely. They killed them all. But some survived in the northern reaches of Northwest Territory in Canada, and some of those were transported to Nunivak Island. And that all went well. They did very well, but finally they ate up their resources, and there were too many, and they weren't managed properly, so they decided they need to, they were dying off from starvation, so they decided they need to transport some of them back to the North Slope. This was the first proposed transport. So planes landed with 16 2x4 and 3/4 inch thick plywood boxes. Each box contained a muskox, male or female. We loaded them, or they loaded them, with a forklift onto the sleds behind snow machines. And away we went off the island onto the North Slope. There were 2 fish and feathers guys there to manage the whole thing. They lined up the boxes, and everybody, including me, got on top of one box until we had 16 of them. They pulled the bolts open, and we made the message, and we pulled the gates up and let the muskox out. And away they went. I mean, they just tore out. Because these starved poor animals that had been confined for a long time, they all left except one. One bull jumped out, turned around, and it happened to be a fish and feathers guy that was on top of his box, and he charged the box, charged it until he beat it to pieces, and the guy had run off behind another box and hid that muskox after him, but it didn't take. After all this, very quickly, it didn't take long before the muskox ran out of gas and was emancipated anyway and stressed, and down he went. And so he loaded him one of the sleds behind a snow machine, and the muskox was done. I mean, he'd done his thing, and the fish and feathers guy nodded to me, and I reached over and cut his throat. Then went back to the village to be utilized for meat, which they'd never had before, and I don't think was much because, like I said, he was in pretty poor shape. And the muskox also has unbelievable fur. It's long and waterproof and extremely thermal. And they take the muskox fur and they trim it off and weave it into what is called quivet. They make quivet shawls, quivet scarves, and these are very valuable. They're very expensive to buy them because there isn't a whole lot of quivet around. But anyway, I'm sure that the muskox got shaved down to his skin and Eskimo mittens and scarves and whatever, but I don't know. I don't own a piece of quivet, and the Eskimos that I used to live with had beautiful scarves made of quivet, and it's unbelievable. It is soft, fluffy, and extremely warm. So anyway, that's just a little bit of history on the muskox. And all that happened by accident. I just happened to be there at the right time. You know, it was an unbelievable experience, and the traditional Eskimos that were in Kaktovik showed up for a party afterwards and were dressed in unbelievable, beautiful robes and parkas. And that is just a great experience. At any rate, I had my polar bear hide, I had my polar bear skull. And a couple of days later, I loaded into a Wien Airlines, which is now Alaska Airlines, at that time was Wien, that landed occasionally at the missile site. They didn't land in Kaktovik because that was a small plane operation there. But anyway, I got on the Weenie Bird and went back to Fairbanks and met up with my beautiful wife and sent the polar bear to Jonas Brothers Taxidermy in Denver. That's about all I can say about that story. I've probably thrown in more than they wanted to listen to, but it was an adventure. Somewhere along the line, maybe the next chapter or two, we'll talk about Fainus and Ginya, who was Ned's wife, who know quite well because they'd come to Fairbanks for religious observations, and we would pick them up at the airport and they would stay with us. But Faye was an unusual Eskimo woman. She wasn't totally subservient. Like a lot of them, she was a hunter, and it was in her blood. She was a hunter. Now, she didn't get a chance to use much of that desire, but she did some, and I've got a pretty interesting story about Faye Nusenginya. This is Jerry Meringue again with Chapter 3 of the Wilderness Experience, or Odyssey, and this is one that is labeled walrus hunting. You might have to be a little patient here because this is a very complicated subject for me. It was a long, arduous, dangerous experience and hunt for a long time in the month of August. And there's a whole lot to say that I have photographs to back up almost everything that I'm going to tell you. I wanted to hunt walrus, but that was pretty much unknown at that time. Only Eskimos hunted walrus, and there wasn't any actual path to be able to do so. But one of the women I was counseling with, Irene Cleworth, knew a minister in Wainwright, Alaska that lived among the Eskimos. So she contacted him, and lo and behold, he invited me up and introduced me to a hunter to take me hunting for walrus, and said he'd put me up for a month, that I was going to be there. So I left Fairbanks around the 1st of August, maybe a little later in July, and flew to Point Barrow, which is 90 miles from Wainwright, east of Wainwright. Barrow is a town of Eskimos and whites of about 1,500, but was kind of a welfare state. That's where all the Eskimos went to gather up their chicks. There was also several government agencies there, like wildlife research in the Arctic and so forth. Anyway, I spent a day or two there, staying at the top of the World Motel, which Donna stayed at when she hunted polar bear up there, and eventually caught a mail plane 90 miles to the west to the pure Eskimo village of Wainwright, a village of hunters. That's what they did. Probably I would estimate it about 200 souls. At any rate, we landed there and was met by this minister, and he very graciously accepted me into his home and introduced me to Andrew Egok, who was the Eskimo he had chosen to take me walrus hunting. Andrew was such a cool little guy, and I have a lot of respect for him. At any rate, we landed out for the next morning, and we were going to go out and look for some walrus. He had about a 21 foot skin boat made of split walrus hide, and the bones of the boat were driftwood. Very sturdy little boat, and a 25 horse Evinrude outboard. The shoreline was pretty much open water, but there was still a lot of floating ice. The Arctic is shallow, and for about a mile and a half out from shore, it freezes to the ground, freezes to the bottom, and it's called anchor ice. The pack ice, which flows towards Norway, rubs up against it, as I've mentioned previously, and it chafes, and that's another story. I have stories like that too. Anyway, we had some open water, the anchor ice, and spent 3 days looking for walrus, but finally determined that the walrus hadn't floated that far north and east yet. So we piddled around, spending a few days on ice, camping on the shore and ice, and killed the occasional seal or single caribou that was near the shore. And we hauled these back to the village and spent a day or two there. I got to meet a few people, and away we went again. And so it happened that we came upon a big sand split, a place called Icy Cape. At the end of that sand split on the ocean, there were about 300 head of caribou, and at least that many, perhaps more. And they were standing in the water because at that time of the year, heel flies were bad, and the flies attack their heels, larvae crawl up into their backs and make pustules. Anyway, there they were. So Andrew was grinning from ear to ear and said, "Caribou, we get them." He could speak a little bit of English, and I could speak a little bit of Inupiq, but mainly it was sign language. So we landed the boat in the middle of the spit, which was about 40 yards wide, and we dumped all the gear out of a 50-gallon barrel we had in the boat. By the time we carried the snow machine in the boat, it didn't take, I mentioned that's when we got jammed up, and that was for when we got jammed up in the ice. We could pull the snow machine out and pull the boat over to the next lead. Hopefully there was one, and we had experienced that later. But anyway, he sets the barrel up towards the edge of the spit and put me out with 4 guns, 2 walrus guns and 2 seal guns, and a box of ammo or more for each one. Set me down in a certain spot and told me to shoot only big bulls. Big bulls were fat that time of the year, and the cows and small bulls weren't. So it was very important that they were a hunting village. They provide Eskimo meat for the village of Barrow, 90 miles away, so we're actually hunting for the market, and we did the same with walrus, by the way. Anyway, he landed me up, and he waded into the caribou and started running them by me. They'd come by 1 at a time, 4 at a time, whatever. I'd poke a hole, a double lung. Each came by and trade guns and grab another gun, load another gun, shoot, and finally he waved his arms and let remaining caribou pass me. There were about 20 more than actually panicked and got under the water and climbed up onto ice shelves that were floating among that we dodged coming in there. And where they went I never knew, but I'm sure they made it to shore somewhere east of there. Anyway, he came up to me after the caribou had either gone or went out to sea, and we had 16 big bulls down, all within 100 yards of each other. So he was pretty happy with that, because that's how he made his winter money. Well, actually, I learned how the Eskimos butchered caribou from the singles we killed before. You just cut them in half at about the second rib up from the bottom, pull the two halves apart, pull the lungs and guts out, and go to the next one. So we'll be back, and he jumped in his boat, and away he went, traveling like hell. We were probably only 3 miles from the village, maybe 4. By the time I'd taken probably 3 or 4 of these caribou and done the Eskimo gut pile trick, he and 4 other boats behind him came, and they had guys in them and wives and kids, and they landed their boats and came up on the shore and climbed on the caribou. Never said a word to me, nothing. They just went about working. One woman went around collecting all the tongues. The other one followed butchers and took the livers, kidneys, and hearts. And the men were busy pulling them apart and jerking out the pieces, and the kids were there. 6 of them, or 7 or 8, were dragging the halves. They cut the heads off too, and by the way, that was a woman's job, to cut out the tongues. And they were dragging them down to the boats. And hell, I mean, it was quick, and I was all watching these oodles flying in blood, and it was a good show. And pretty soon 4 or 5 boats pulled away, and they were gone. I looked for Andrew, and he's just staying there smiling. Went down to his boat, and there were 5 caribou halves. 5 caribou halves. 10 caribou had 5 caribou in his boat. And he said, a good day, good hunt, and we went back to the village. On his doorstep there were 2 buckets, one with a half a dozen caribou tongues, the other with a whole pile of liver, kidneys, and hearts. Andrew's family, well, now I might ask, in the middle of July or in August, what do they do with meat so it won't spoil? Well, each family had a big freezer, because permafrost was about a foot down, and you more or less scrape the moss off at 6 or 7 inches, and the ground is frozen. They had carved holes into it, maybe 3 feet, 4 feet down, and then there was a cavern about the size of my bathroom, or your bathroom, with shelves in it, where we pulled up and took his halves of caribou and dropped them down into the hole. And there was a guy there, his father, I think, stayed down there and placed them on the shelves, and that's how we stayed frozen until wintertime, when there was snow machine them to the village of Point Barrow, where all the welfare people were looking for meat, and we did the same later with walrus meat. We didn't have any anyway, but that was the thrust of my caribou segment of this walrus hunt, and it was pretty exciting for a guy like me, because I got to be the gunner. It was kind of interesting, because all the time, not one Eskimo woman or man came up to me and said, hey, nice shooting. But that's what they expected, and that's what they did in their life. And I was a white man, so I just happened to have the gun. We celebrated, sitting around sleeping, and watching people skin seals or whatever in the village. Gave me a chance to walk around and meet people and communicate a little with the preacher and his wife, who were delighted in there. We finally decided we were going to go hunting walrus again, because they hadn't been there yet, but maybe they were now. Anyway, we loaded up the skin boat and took off. Spent a couple of days bouncing around the water, climbing over ice shelves. Finally came upon a lone walrus. Happened to be the walrus head and tusks I'm looking at right now in my living room. And Andrew, through a lot of sign language, and finally convinced me that this was not a regular walrus, what we would call a rogue. Didn't travel with the other walrus, and they normally travel together, and this was a rogue. And he says sometimes they lose their appetite for clams, and like seals, but their average walrus diet, we'll get into this later, is clams. They use their tusks to dig them up, and clams, and this large gigantic piston of a tongue to suck the clam out of the shell. But once in a while, walrus has a taste for seal. Anyway, this was one of those. So we went after him. There was a lot of open water, and down he went, came back up, and right on pretty soon he started to porpoise, which is what any sea animal does. If they really want to cover ground, they don't just dive underwater and swim, because there's too much friction. They jump in and out, pow, 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 and that's what this walrus finally started to do. I stood on the bow of the boat with a coil of rope alongside my feet, Andrew's harpoon, and away we went. We chased him for a long time, minutes, but to me it was a long time because I was scared shitless. I'm standing with a harpoon and I got to perform anyway. I finally got it right, and the timing up, down, and making sure my feet didn't get tangled up in the rope that was coiled beneath me, which I knew would have been death, and finally flung the harpoon, and it was right next to the bow, so it wasn't any big deal, but I got him right in the neck. The harpoon went deep. I threw the rope over and tied the buoy, and the rope's tied to a buoy. Usually our buoys are seal stomachs, which are sealed off and blown up, but this was a regular orange buoy. And the way the buoy went, I went chasing it around and around a couple times on the shelf of ice and came from the other side, and finally started going slower and slower, and Andrew pulled the buoy. I grabbed the hold of the rope. We tied off to a cleat, and Andrew cut the motor and came up and started pulling the rope. Finally, we got the walrus up and thrashing, and I took my 300 Magnum and gave him a shot. I'd already been told where to shoot a walrus. You can only kill a walrus in two places other than you're wasting your ammo. Anyway, I shot him and killed him. And we drug him over the ice floe and attached the rope and pulled him up on this, I'm not saying iceberg because it was not an iceberg, it was a chunk of ice floe that we butchered him. And how they butcher walrus is interesting because they mainly interested in the blubber. This walrus had anywhere from 4 to 5 inches of blubber between his skin and his meat, and which they take an ulu, which the women use, only it's a handsaw that's shaped round like an ulu. It's rounded and sharpened. You got a good grip on it. So they cut chunks about 3 feet by 3 feet and peel the fat off the skin and cut 2 handles. So you've got it like a 70-pound suitcase. They do that with the whole walrus. We use the boat to roll the walrus over and cut off big chunks of blubber, and which they sell for 35 cents a pound. Though caribou fat caribou bring 50 cents a pound. Anyway, this was all money for Andrew, so it would take a couple hours to cut the head off, and the big penis bone, which most have seen in my house here because Andrew Egock's father carved ivory walrus and polar bear on the ends of it. Anyway, that he strips off some of the meat, and they're not heavy on walrus meat, but he did take some meat, and we loaded it all on the boat and headed back to town, which is maybe 40 minutes away. Maybe an hour of dodging little chunks of ice and about a half mile out of town. Andrew makes this wild holler. I'd heard it afterwards too, and it's the same they use in greeting when they got to shore and there was a snow machine waiting there with a sled that's cowling off to run on the sand and out in the tundra. Anyway, that's a snow machine there with probably 20 people, and we loaded everything on the sled and pulled up the preacher's house. He came out and distributed the meat, which kind of surprised me. Andrew got a good chunk of it, but the other people did too. And then we went over to Andrew's house and he dropped the caribou, like we dropped the caribou chunks down, and somebody was there collecting it and putting it on the shelves. Andrew gave the head and usik to his father, who later prepared the skull and skin and boiled it after they do, and the usik he skinned it and boiled it, and whatever they do, and carved ivory ends on it. I had my walrus, and again we had celebration at the preacher's house involving caribou meat, no drinks. I didn't have anything to drink then, and about 2 days later Andrew showed up and he said, "We go walrus hunting," because the walrus finally came, and this one was a predecessor to what was coming. But anyway, they had reports from the Tundra Topics hotline that there were walrus to be gotten. So he took me down to the shore and introduced me to 2 guys I would never have got to go on this trip, that were getting ready to go if I hadn't earned my spurs by harpooning a walrus, which I don't know that any of them ever done that before, but it doesn't matter. I was invited on a major walrus hunt. This was big time shit. I mean, I was ready to go home and had mine, but I couldn't miss this. So I loaded up a bigger skin boat and took supplies for probably 3 or 4 days. I'm missing some stuff here because some exciting things happened between there. Anyway, we took off. Now, the Eskimo way of traveling, you don't panic. Every 2 hours you stop, light up a Coleman stove, set up a tea, and I had, because I was so excited about being invited before my trip for a big walrus hunt, that I said, hey, I'm going to be the one at the co-op store and buy all the grub for this. At the co-op store involved coffee, sugar, flour, half a dozen kinds of canned food, and went there and bought about everything they had in a sack of flour. I didn't know what I was buying, and a big damn box of tea came with the containers and glass containers, so that it went well. We were headed west. I got about 2 hours out. The boat stopped. Everybody got out. All respected me because didn't know me. And the walrus fired up the Coleman, got water out. Everybody a cup of tea, and all of a sudden everybody poured the tea out, put everything back in the boat, and back to the village. We went well with the tea and sugar in it, but they didn't want that anyway. So one of the guys took the sugar tea and traded it for regular tea. Came back and nobody bitched about it. Nobody said a word to me. Hell, they didn't even comment. Andrew was the only one, and he knew any English at all, but not much of the guys knew none. So we loaded back up and took off again. In 2 or 3 hours we stopped. D-Bank was kind of interesting, sadly, because the whole thing, they didn't recommend me or knock on me because they didn't send me home. They just went and got the right kind of tea, and away we went. It's kind of complicated now because we're going to do is attack walrus at a real spiritual meeting. And we had some prayers that night. We camped on the shore, and we camped on the ice. Sometimes we camped on the shore, and they had this spiritual thing that just kept my mouth shut. And when we turned, they said, now here's some things you need to know. We're going to attack a group of walrus, and they're going to be on the ice floe, and we're going to just lay there, and they're going to pull up. We're going to have all of our hoods up, pull up, speak, and nobody speaks English. We don't know how, but you do not say a word. Talking is not let a walrus see your face, because we can talk to a walrus, and they cannot. They will kill you, and so forth. And so I'm going on shit, man. I mean, I'm like you guys, I didn't say I kept my parka hood up and face pulled up tight and didn't say a word. Sometimes we pull up an ice floe and a walrus on it. It takes a long time to communicate all this. And Andrew, my interpreter, can't speak English much, so it's quite a trip. Sometimes when you pull up to an anchor at ice, you get out of the boat, and sometimes there's a big walrus swimming around the ice floe, and they'll pop up out of the water and hook their ivories over the boat and look at it and study us, and they may happen, and that may well happen. It has happened to all of us before. When it does happen, you turn away from that walrus. You do not look at him. You do not open your mouth. We will talk to him and explain to him that we're going to, our children will work their way through it, and we don't have drop rips in the side of the boat, and we drowned. And we got a white man, yeah, fucking totally a man anyway. We went through and all that quite a while because I knew these guys knew what's going on. They've been watching the birds and watching the clouds. Always fly from water to land and the land to water, and they tell them things they travel. Some look down and sideways. They don't know, but they're telling things. So I knew we were getting told things, and we're close anyway. I hope I'm not boring you with this, but it was too much. It was too much, and I'm leaving a lot of stuff out because I don't want to destroy the credibility with you. Anyway, we took off next morning, and it's within half an hour. We were on ice floe about the size of my whole building. And then we pulled up to it, and there were walrus laying all over it. I mean, just an estimated 30 walrus just laying in ice pack, closely packed together, all individually, but pretty much filled it up. At this point, I will end this story as it gets very bloody, complicated, and somewhat difficult to believe. Perhaps in another day. Hi, this is Jerry again, and this is Jerry and Donna in an adventure regarding rainbow trout and sockeye salmon. And it occurred about the middle of July, somewhere in the mid-1970s. Our friends and fellow teachers, Dick Henderson and Marlis Henderson, were going to accompany us, and we're all going to end up at 3 lakes outside of the Wrangell Mountains, outside of Talkeetna, Alaska. We took off in 2 vehicles, drove to Talkeetna, west of Fairbanks, about 175 miles. Then we chartered a Cessna 185 to take us to T-Bay Lakes, which is a series of 3 lakes in the foothills of the magnificent Wrangell Mountains, about 50 miles, which are a series of from Talkeetna, or more like 75. We got to T-Bay, landed the 185, coasted to a dock, met by a man named Rudy Gray, who I'd never met before, because he was in charge of the lodge, which was simply a couple cabins and a larger cabin, which they called the lodge. We were the only guests, so it worked out pretty well. I met Rudy somewhere down the line, but we never really did know him. But I found out later I would get to know him very well. He was taking a teaching job in Bettles, Alaska, which is kind of one of my drop-off points when I hunted the Brooks Range, when I pick up clients and pick up hunters, or maybe spend the night gas up. At any rate, later I met Rudy, that we became very good friends, and stayed at his camp in Bettles several times, and he flew a Citabria GCBC just like mine, so we had a lot in common at any rate. He met us and escorted us to our cabin with our gear and said, "Supper will be whenever you want it, and it won't be when you might think it should be. You can cook your own, but at any rate, here's a cabin and here's the boat. A little 12-foot rowboat. Just go fish as long as you want, and when you come back, let me know and we'll do whatever we need to do. So organize a cabin, get your stuff arranged, unpack your gear, and our probably 4 or 5 coolers filled with ice. Took it down to the dock and pointed to a little 12-foot boat with oars, and away we went. We were all fly fishermen, some more experienced than others, but we were all fly fishermen, and we're looking for fish raising on this first of 3 lakes. We saw a few here and there. We caught a fish or two, but it wasn't really hot, so we kept oaring until we got to the end of the lake, which took at least a half an hour more, and where the creek came into the lake, which was fed by the lake up above. Probably, I'd say, 50 yards, pretty good creek flowed into the lake. At that point, we saw a lot of fish rising, and that probably had to do with the fact that the creek flowed was oxidizing the water in the first lake and bringing nutrients down anyway. There's a lot rising, so we stopped, jumped out with our waders and fly poles and started flinging the air. The fish were there, and about every 4th cast, we'd hook one. I was using a blue dun or mosquito, and within a half an hour or less, we had gathered up a huge string of 12 to 16-inch rainbow trout, which was more than enough to feed us all. We decided, hey, that's enough fish. Now we're fishing catch and release. So we staked out that bunch of fish, and hopefully with supper, and probably a lot of suppers for a bunch of magpies. Drug the boat up to the second lake. Essentially the same thing. Went around the shore, caught a couple fish. Eventually up another creek, a smaller creek leading in, and again, catch and release. We didn't keep any, but we fished until we fished hard. And all that fishing needed was a little while in the boat. Caught the fish again. We didn't keep any of those fish, but wished, what the heck, that's all the fishing needed to do for a little while. We drug the boat up, we explored a little, drug the boat up a little further into the creek. The third lake did the same thing. We oared around and threw along the casting once we were catching a fish, got up to the end, and there was no more lakes. Appeased our fishing ambitions by catching a few more and headed down. We'd probably been there, gone from T-Bay, our lodge, probably 4 hours by then, so we're starting to get hungry. So anyway, we paddled through the lakes and got last one, picked up our stringer of fish, couldn't resist stopping and catching a few more, and headed back and pulled out the little dock where Rudy was waiting for us, and he said, "You guys want fish for supper? It looks like you got some." So he said, "Give me a half an hour and then you can have a fish fry." Went to the cabin, did our gear, did some dry clothes on, wandered over to Ruby's larger cabin, which was a lodge, and had a wonderful meal of green salad, rainbow trout. We gorged on that and went back to the cabin, settled in for the night, played a little cribbage and a couple other games, Yahtzee or games, I don't know which, and went. Got to bed the next morning. Rudy had a wonderful breakfast for us of sausage, hotcakes, and eggs. This was our second day, and only 3 days we wanted, and we only had 3 days there, so we wanted to do a little more fishing. So we went straight out of the lake and again started slinging flies around, catching and releasing, and did the same thing. And went to the second lake and the same thing again. So I went to the bigger lake. We just cruised the edges waiting for fish to rise. Someone would cast. Eventually we spent hours and hours cruising around 3 lakes. At the bottom lake, we went to the cabin. Didn't matter because there was no darkness anyway, but we could tell when you got hungry it was time to head home. That's what we did. We got back, we pulled up. Rudy had developed, by using small pine trees, made an ark and covered it with 4 or 5 tarps. Put a small camp stove in, and there he had a sauna. He said, well, I'm going to cook. You guys have some supper, but I thought maybe you might want to have a little sauna before you did. We all jumped on that, went back to the cabin, dressed appropriately, and cut off some gear we could use for the sauna, and went and jumped in the sauna. It was hot, and sweat rolled off us like 15-20 minutes, but all we could take. Every one of us jumped through the flap of the tent and jumped into the lake. It was cold running off the Wrangell Mountain glaciers, naturally, and went back in the sauna again 3 times. We did that, and finally that was it. It was all any of us could take. We stumbled back to the cabin, got dressed, and we're weighing when Rudy's cabin and had the meal of hamburgers, and it was all we could handle. Next morning, the plane supposed to come in at about 10, and we wandered around camp a couple trails here and there and went back and packed our gear and sleeping bags, rejuvenated our coolers with ice, and the plane came in a 185 Cessna and took us back to Talkeetna. Well, there we switched gears. We had a full camp set up, both pickups and dip nets. The dip net is a very large, maybe 3 foot across net, very deep, with a long handle and an extension on it. We're going to go dip netting sockeye salmon in the Copper River. Now, this was before the Copper River Reds became a big item. Later I learned, maybe 5, I don't know, years later it became an advertisement token and a wonderful advertisement ply. The Copper River Reds were sought to be the best salmon, and that they were the biggest salmon. They were plumper, they were fatter, they were oilier, and the best Seattle-Portland market took advantage of that when the Copper River Reds came in July. Then it was like a big adventure thing. They became Copper River Reds, became famous, and they were bigger, and I don't know if they were any better tasting, but I think anyway we got Copper River to catch some Copper River Reds at that time. They were just sockeye salmon caught out of the Copper River, but it took us probably a half an hour to get to the Copper River again, the Shadow Wrangell Mountains. The Copper River is a huge river that flows fast and long because it has glacial till from the Wrangell Mountains. It wasn't muddy. It was just totally opaque. You couldn't see into it. You had to put a half-inch of water in your hand, and you couldn't see the bottom of it. It was like you couldn't see into the water. Anyway, we pulled up to where people had traditionally camped, set up our camp. Saw 4 fishermen down there with their dip nets in the water and about a half a dozen sockeye salmon up on the shore. So, okay, well, this is looking good. So we set up our camp, grabbed our dip nets, went down the river, and as I said, the Copper River is big and mighty, but the fish and the red salmon and sockeye salmon came up there by probably millions. I mean, it was a big run always, and it was always a very large king salmon run too. So I went down and I thought the first time I waded in the water, as I could drop my net, I looked up at the Wrangell Mountains and thought, I know I'm looking for a camera in there somewhere because it must be the biggest snipe hunt I've ever been on. Probably called the Copper River Sockeye Salmon Snipe Hunt, because who'd stand in the water up to their waist with a long pole stuck in the water you couldn't see into or hope that fish swam into it, but they did. The salmon would come up the river depending upon the tide out at Prince William Sound, and we probably fished 2 hours and our nets were empty, and all of a sudden, wham, bam, everybody got a hit. When the salmon swam into your net, you'd better pull the son of a bitch out real quick. I'd say within a half an hour, we had another 10 sockeye or Copper River Reds laying on the beach. By then, we're all tired, and we had fish to drag up, fish to clean, so we took them to camp, put them on ice, and started a big fire. We put up in Talkeetna and straightened out our sleeping bags in the tents and went to sleep. Next morning we did the same thing. Dropped our nets. This time it didn't take so long. Another wave coming, so wham bam, thank you ma'am. We got another bunch of nice reds, and Dick Henderson was fortunate enough to have a great big king salmon in his net. I thought he was going to pull him in, but he didn't, because he's a stout little booger, and he drug the fish up. We had another 8 or 10 sockeyes and great big king. We ate some lunch, made some bologna sandwiches, loaded up and took off because we didn't know it, but about halfway to Talkeetna and Paxson, there was a road that took off to the south for about 12 miles, and it had a glacier that Dick knew about. So we went and found this glacier, crawled up on it, chopped off huge chunks of beautiful blue-colored hard crystallite, and filled up our coolers. We had 5 or 6 of them with fish. And after lunches, we went home and another 150 miles back to Fairbanks. And away we went. Now I'm going to stop for a second here and have a drink, because what I'm going to tell you next, I expect Rod Sterling to come around the corner any minute, because it was a pretty weird situation. Anyway, we got home. Dick and Marlis went their way, and we went ours. We came to our home at 6 Mile Steese. And I and Donna jumped out and started hauling things to the house. I grabbed the coolers and strung a bunch of sockeyes on the lawn, and I went to the house to get my knives, because I was going to fillet them. What we do is fillet fish, vacuum pack them, and put them in the freezer for a winter. It made sense. We did it all the time. I got back to a bunch of sockeyes, plywood sheet I'd laid down, and the ground wasp had totally taken over. Now, that was the year when the ground wasp, it was the year of the ground wasp. Brandy had been walking out in the other garden maybe 2 weeks earlier and fell down and put her face right into one of the holes, and where they live in the ground. They're voracious animals, and they're meat eaters. It sounds kind of weird, but that's the way it was. They whacked her hard, down and drug her back to the house. Her head was like a watermelon. Went to the hospital, and of course she survived. A few days later, I was down at the bottom end of the property with a chainsaw, knocking down a couple of trees for various reasons, and I looked up and see a bullet coming from the left side hit me right in the temple and put me to my knees. Well, it was a ground wasp, but I was getting close to home or whatever, pissed him off, and down I went, blacked out. But it wasn't black, it was shining light in my eyes. I couldn't see anything except white. So I shut my chainsaw off maybe half an hour, and I could catch a glimmer of things. It was hours before I was able to get my sight back, and a headache 2 days. But anyway, it was ground wasps that did it. I guess I've said enough about that. I went to the fish, and there they were lined up on this plywood, and they were smothered by ground wasps, maybe hundreds, maybe more, flying over and buzzing and landing. Well, I don't know if I handled this, because I already had one at the temple and didn't want any more. So I went to my shop, which is pretty much right there. I was a welder, and I had welding gear, and I put on my welding big leather coat, dropped to my knees, put on welding gloves, my hood, put a propane weed burner, which I always have because I use it for trapping, and my pickup started, and went out in the back lawn and started waving around like a crazy man, and Donna up on the porch screaming for me, probably telling me to kill the wasp, maybe telling me to get the hell out of there. I don't know, because she'll straighten things up out in a minute. But anyway, I waved the thing around and burned up enough wasps. I almost cooked the fish, but in fact they were starting to sizzle because they had the skin on, and waving it around, shot him out of the air and shot him backwards, waited till they came back, and finally there was just a very few wasps flying around, but the fish were covered with dead wasps and ground around them. So I stood there a while, picking out a few that were anything and landed on the fish, were cooked. Eventually there were no more flies around, and hauled the fish 10 feet away in the plywood, and then shook off the dead wasp, decided to go ahead and start flaming. I thought, bullshit. I mean, there's probably more than I picked up. Welding gear and everything, and I hauled them to the house and threw them on the table and went to work. Back to the shop, took off my welding gear, went up, and that's pretty much the end of my adventure. I know it sounds pretty weird, but that's just the way it was. We survived it all, and by the end of the week we had passed, so Brandy was okay. with that. I was okay with mine and probably just killed several hundred more wasps with my weed burner, but what the hell? They're trying to make a living too. But they got in the way of making my living and eventually put the salmon up on the freezer. And we had enough fish to get us through the rest of the winter. Okay, our next chapter of the Alaskan Odyssey with Jerry and Donna. This is different than the others in that it doesn't involve a lot of dead animals or skinning or whatever, but it is about the wolverine, an animal that I have great respect and fear for. As I mentioned, in one of my other chapters, one of the few toe-to-toe battles I've had with animals, one of them was a wolverine. But this chapter is going to be a couple incidents that I had with wolverines from the air. And part of what I got out of the experiences was a tremendous respect for the tenaciousness and fearlessness of the mighty wolverine. The first experience was on an aerial wolf hunt, and the gunner or partner in the back of me, the plane, was Ross Harry. I'd picked up in Wiseman, and we headed over toward the Chandelar area looking for wolves, and really had no other idea of where to go other than just to search and of course then destroy. After a while, I noticed several ravens circling over an area of timber of open ground. I headed directly over there, knowing that ravens were there. There was something to eat, and below them was the reason they weren't done eating. And that was there were predators that had control of whatever it was. So I flew straight there, and as I approached, I saw a dead caribou and a wolverine right on top doing his supper. Or at that time, it was brunch, about 5 wolves sitting around in a circle, just like dogs, sitting there watching the wolverine eat the caribou that they had undoubtedly killed. Now, any common sense would tell you that 5 150-pound vicious wolves can take on a small 50-pound wolverine. But the wolves knew from past experience or from DNA that taking him on wouldn't have been worth it. They probably would have killed him. But in the meantime, he would have wreaked havoc and done terrible damage on them, because there's actually nothing tougher than a wolverine pound for pound that I'm aware of. Some wolves would at least be wounded, and the wounded ones, a wounded predator is a dead predator. Anyway, as soon as we got real close to him, the wolves all took off. And they knew again from experience or DNA that there was danger, and all the spokes of a wheel that they made as they took off in different directions, with the wolverine just sat there on the caribou eating like nothing was going on. One of the wolves took off in a direction that I thought we may be able to do some good with, because it was open ground and an open ridge ahead where he was at, and the rest of them were trying to timber up. So directly at the wolf was headed for the more open ground, and got lucky and put him down, and I actually landed and taxied right up to the wolf. Didn't take long. We tied him onto the strut and took off, hoping we could get another wolf while we were at it. Flew back to the kill, started making circles, largely looking for the other 4 wolves that were left, but to no avail. So I flew back over the dead caribou, and the wolverine was still there eating, and he would stand up and snarl at us as we flew over him at about 10 feet. All he wanted to do was fight, and he definitely wasn't ready to run. At any rate, that's one experience I had with Wolverine that showed me quite a bit about his character and his toughness. And this experience was probably that year or maybe the year after, somewhere in the 80s, and it would have been February, toward the end of it, when there was enough light to be able to make it worthwhile flying for a couple hours. But at any rate, I'm back in the same area. I had a different gunner of mine I'd worked with on the North Slope named Bill Keith. And always there was, at any rate, I heard there were caribou over in the Arctic. So we headed straight in that direction, and we had no lack of finding wolves or wolf pack, but coming down on one of the steep drainages, I noticed a plow trail going down through the bottom, and a wolverine has short legs and strong legs, so the snow is deep and all. It doesn't leave footprints, it just leaves a plow trail. And I knew that, so I got on that and followed it almost straight away. I saw a smaller track take off, and one that go off to the side and then come back and dart again a trail, and the wolverine was going to make. The wolverine is going straight. But the other set of tracks was going from side to side, getting up a little elevation, looking back to see where he was and what was chasing him. That continued on for probably another mile. But the little jog backs off and forth, becomes shorter and shorter as a fox, as it was, received more and more panic. The next thing was blood spot in the snow. And the wolverine had caught up with the fox, and the fox had caught up with him basically and stomped snow all around the carcass. And I made a couple trips over it. Wolverine tracks or plow tracks just kept going straight on down the canyon like nothing had happened. Well, I didn't follow him because taking a wolverine from the air is damn difficult because other animals, as wolves, as soon as the airplane approaches, they start running, and they run pretty much straight. But Wolverine doesn't run. As soon as he knows there's an airplane buzzing him, he just turns around and stops and wants to fight. Hard to shoot an animal from an airplane when it's going 35 miles an hour at a stop target. It's very difficult. So we didn't spend any time with that. We just continued on the wolf hunt. To no avail, by the way. We didn't find any more wolves, but somewhere along the line, my gunner behind said, "Hey, let's find a restroom." So I looked up ahead, and to the left, there's a great big lake, a long lake. I'd have to get a map out to locate it, and maybe it had a name, but it doesn't. I thought, well, good, because good as the restroom as any. So I landed up on the middle of the lake and cut the power, and down I went. As soon as the skis touched going through, I knew something was wrong because it wasn't slippery. It was more like skis were on grit. I looked down, and I landed on overflow. Now it happens when rivers and sometimes big lakes, the weight of the ice and snow above it causes ice to dip down in the center of the lake, and water squeezes up through the cracks to form slush beneath the snow. Normally on a clear day you can see the color. It was a cloudy day and I couldn't see it. I'm trying to land in a pile of slush. I immediately got full power and get up and then get out of there, but it wasn't that easy because my full power didn't bring me enough speed to get airborne. So I just kept power on and probably moving along at about 20 miles an hour, my guess. It wasn't clear, but all I could do was stay on and keep the stick back. Pretty soon we came far enough out of the overflow. We got onto regular ice, and I immediately began to pick up some speed, but it was still slow, and I'm glad the lake was big. I mean, it was big enough so to land 30 or 40 times in a row, but in line in a row. But in line. But anyway, my speed increased and increased and increased. And I looked down. I could see I wasn't picking up any more speed. My skis looked like pontoons. They were ice froze on them. But at any rate, by the time we went another couple 100 yards, I got up to where I could feel and see the speed was enough to fly. So I pulled back on the stick, and it said no fly because of all the weight. I just kept pounding, and eventually I got up enough speed that we took off. We're a long way from anywhere, so 100 miles from where there was an airport, and I needed one. And I swung back and headed for Bettles, about to keep the plane above the treetops, and that's about all. Occasionally we got a little higher, but there was no gaining in power. It was no gain in speed or elevation. It was just maintaining. Eventually I saw the airstrip in Bettles lined up, and didn't even talk to the FAA station or the guy in it. I just came in for a landing, and wham! It came with lots of power because I cut the power. In normal landing I would have just dropped. I came in with probably three-quarters power landing, and as soon as I hit, all hell broke loose and the ice flew off the skis. A lot of it anyway. A chunk of it flew up right through the fabric of my left wing, and the other one was thumping and bumping against the bottom of the plane. We did get down. I taxied over the little FAA station where Ron Costello and says, "Hey, you got an overflow?" I said, "Yeah, right, Ron." He said, "Well, let's get the ice off." So we went and got some tools and chipped all the ice we could in the skis and cleaned up the bungees, and went back and got a roll of duct tape, patched up the hole in the wing, had a steaming hot cup of coffee or two, gassed up and headed to Fairbanks with little or no wolves hanging from our airplane. With only a little wisdom and knowledge gained about overflows. And that was the end of the wolf hunt. And that was the end of this tale. Thank you very much. This chapter of the Wilderness Odyssey does not include Jerry Donna. It includes, as the main actor, Ross Harry, a friend of mine from a long way back. I moved him into the Brooks Range in the 1970s to help him from being successful or happy. He was not a successful or happy teacher in Fairbanks. At any rate, I'd spent the summer with him since then, prospecting gold, hunting, mainly hunting. In the wintertime, Ross trapped and tried to stay out of trouble, which wasn't very successful. At any rate, I went to the Brooks Range. Wiseman went up with Ross. Before that, I had contacted him by a tundra telegraph that I was coming up in there in 2 or 3 days. Well, it's customary, and there's actually an unwritten rule in the Brooks Range. And a few people were there then. When you did get a visitor, you provided Dall sheep meat for him, which is the premier of all meats, and still is of all meats. So anyway, Ross had a monkey on his back. He had to kill a Dall sheep. And it was about the 1st of June, probably about that time. He grabbed his 7mm Magnum and headed up the river 5 or 6 miles to a cabin he had, a trapping cabin on Vermont Creek, at the base of a mountain that we hunted sheep on many times. The river he followed up was the same river that Donna and I camped on about 10 years earlier. We made the big kills that we've talked about. Anyway, he got to his cabin and his dog and spent the night. Got out in the morning and started up the mountain to get up above timberline, and his dog ran in front of him in a patch of willows, and a great big sow grizzly bear came out after the white husky. As soon as the bear came out into the gravel, he saw Ross and the dog and was running to Ross and swung straight at him. When I left out, the day before, perhaps 2 days, Ross had done the same thing, only with a 7mm Magnum. He got up to a Dall sheep, had a .270 round in the 7mm Magnum, and the gun blew up. The right side of his face was all torn up. It didn't take his eye out, but just about did. It removed a lot of skin in his face. Anyway, I didn't know that at the time, but anyway, he stumbled back to Wiseman, spent the night, got the only other gun he had was a .22 Magnum pump that held about 12 rounds. And away he went back up to Vermont Creek with one eye open and the other he couldn't see. He got to Vermont again, spent the night, and I'm coming the next day, so the pressure's on. Still had his dog, and the bear incident happened. The bear came out and charged straight at him. He totally unloaded the gun, all 12 rounds, or at least 12, into the bear. Threw the gun at the bear, turned around and ran for the first tree he came to, and there weren't many there because it was too high in the mountains, and he grabbed a little black pine, crawled up, which was no problem for the bear. Had the bear made it to that point, he'd have looked back and the bear thrashing on the ground. He was halfway between where he'd shot it and where he'd shot it, and which I think was quite an accident. He stumbled down, went back, got his rifle, what was left of it, went back to Wiseman and waited for me to show up. I got there and saw him and went, what the hell? He explained to me what happened and passed him up the best I could, and give him somebody with half their face ripped off. But anyway, I poured a lot of iodine on it, whatever we could, from Charlie Breck, the other old timer that lived there, and marched back to Vermont Creek. I walked up behind the bear and found the brass of the .22 Magnums where he'd stood and shot, and I saw where the bear had come out of the willow, saw where the bear had run down and the ammo laying there was dead, and walked back to the tree that Ross had scalped trying to climb it. We skinned the bear, or I skinned the bear because Ross wasn't seeing very good, but he's one rough hombre anyway, I'll tell you. I mean, that was his 3rd trip up Vermont Creek in the last 3 days. So anyway, I got another story about what he burned his boots up and had to walk back to Vermont barefooted. But I skinned the bear and had a good look at the head. I tried to figure out where the bullets penetrated. Now, I'd killed grizzly bears before with big guns, and it wasn't easy. I wondered how in the hell he did it with a .22. On the right side of the neck, underneath his chin, his jugular, another shot hit his esophagus, and it sucked enough blood up in 100 or 200 feet that it ran in order to get his lungs filled up, and of course the bear ran out of gas because his brain began receiving any blood at that moment. Anyway, I skinned the bear, went back to Vermont Creek, and we had a celebration. The only celebration we had to celebrate was the fact that Bull Durham cigarettes, and we did have, and that was the next day we walked back to Wiseman, and we had a bear skin. We had a hell of an adventure, which is a small part of it. And we sat around for a few days for Ross to heal and look away, and we're headed for Glacier River, about 10 miles from there, for some prospecting and pick up some fresh meat. By the way, Ross did not have us supply me with fresh Dall sheep meat, and he was accustomed, as was accustomed there, and I never let him forget that. Next chapter in the Alaskan Odyssey with Jerry and Donna Meringue is one, however, that does include Donna. This is a trip with a friend of mine. Excuse me, it does not include Donna. It is a trip I took with a friend of mine. It does not involve dead animals, but involved 10 days of fantastic and unique experience that Don Block and I had encountered on our trip to the Northwest Territories in the Arctic of northern Canada. We planned to do this for some time, but it was August. And the year, I don't know what in the 70s, but we wanted to go to Inuvik, a village in northwest Canada on the banks of the Mackenzie River Delta that was once an Eskimo village, but the Canadians had decided to make it a model city or village and spent a lot of money building houses, painting them bright colors in downtown district, and moved in a variety of government agencies, mainly monitoring the Mackenzie River. About that time the oil industry in northern Canada was just starting up, so there was oil activity and not much to come later. But at any rate, we set up a date and wanted to take off. We called a friend in the FAA to file a flight plan and get the weather for the coast, and he said that it was tight and based on and not good flying weather, so we went off. I hadn't filed my flight plan. I told him you activate flight plans whenever you call me, and that's okay. It was 4 days later when I realized that it was very clear in the Arctic Ocean, as far east as we could see. So in the morning we loaded up our camping gear, 20 gallons of extra fuel in 5-gallon cans, and headed north. Our first goal was the Arctic Ocean, close to the border, near the village of Kaktovik, and we flew over the Tandau Valley, the White Mountains, the Yukon Delta, the Brooks Range, and 100 miles across the North Slope, and landed on the beach of the Arctic Ocean, about as far north as you can get in the United States. At that point, we're feeling pretty good. We made a 4-hour trip and hadn't had any trouble. We loaded fuel up in our airplane and headed east along the Arctic coast, headed for the border between Alaska and Northwest Territories. We flew right along the shore of the Arctic Ocean for about an hour or so until we got to the beginning of the Mackenzie River Delta, which was a huge, huge thing. The delta itself was about 60 miles long, dotted with like hundreds of small islands with timber on them. But the Mackenzie River flowed in, and it brought a lot of nutrients from the Arctic Ocean. So at that point, we started seeing a lot of sea life. The sea life included fantastic walrus on ice floes. We saw beluga whales, a pod of beluga whales, probably 20 of them, and narwhals. I'd never seen a narwhal. At any rate, we were pretty impressed with that. I'm just now talking about it. We crossed the Mackenzie River Delta and finally spotted the town or village of Inuvik. We landed there and set up a camp. We pulled off clear to the side of the runway out of the way in the timber and wandered into town. It was quite an experience just going into this town of Inuvik. It was obviously Wild West. During that time we were there, not just one day, but other times we were there, I saw 4 brutal fistfights out in front of bars, out in front of buildings based on Main Street. And the difference was in Canada doesn't allow firearms, sidearms, handguns, so they didn't, so they weren't strapped on with 6 guns, or at least swinging with their fists. But anyway, we finally landed in a place, a hamburger and supper, and drifted back to camp. After that, pretty much explored the downtown area of Inuvik. Next morning, we were sitting here discussing what to do. I always wanted to go to the village north of there called Tuktoyaktuk. I'd spent time in the Eskimo villages in northern Alaska, and I'd heard that name was a real primitive and worth seeing. Even though it was oil companies had moved that far north in exploration activities, we again gassed up and headed 90 miles pretty much straight north, and a little bit east of the village of Inuvik, which was right out of the end of the world reality. and the weather had changed. It was nice in Inuvik. By the time we got to Tuktoyaktuk, it was kind of wintering up. And even though it was August, it was snowing, but we had no trouble. We followed the coast until I saw a little strip landing, and now where my dialogue is going to get hard to follow, because if someone else is telling a story I'm about to impart to you, I would probably question the veracity and wonder what you told me was too far out. But anyway, we pulled up and landed in this little strip, and there we were, to say 3 or 4 small, squat, flat buildings place where it was some gas pumps. I pulled up to the gas pumps, and Blanca and I got out of the plane, and a guy came out of the closest building and started over to us. He got close to us, and he looked at me. I looked at him, kind of funny, and I thought, oh boy, another one of these Wild West shows here, but okay, I'm ready. Anyway, he pulled his hood back, and I recognized him, and he said, no shit, you came to Fairbanks to collect $300? I looked at him and said, no shit, I did. Well, I had the last thing in my mind was running this guy here, but we're going to travel back to Fairbanks 2 years earlier, and a good friend of mine came to visit Donna and I, talking guns and hunting, and he always had this young guy with him. I got to know him too, and this day I don't remember his name, but at any rate, the last time he came, he informed me that he had been kicked out of the university there in Fairbanks because he'd flunked out and was going to go back home to Canada. I had no idea where in Canada. It was a pretty concise place. It's a pretty concise place, and I don't care. But then we talked a while, and I said, how are you going to get back? And he said, I don't know. I'm going to have to try to pick up a job somewhere or something real quick and get some groceries money. I'm going to have to get back to Canada and get to work in the oil fields because my dad works there, and I know I can get a job. I said, well, if that's all you need is a few bucks to get home, maybe I can help you out, I said, and I handed him $300. So I loaned him $300, and I wrote my name and address on a phone number on a small piece of paper. I said, when you get a job and squared away, send me the money. And he said, hey, there's no problem, and you'll be the first person I contact as soon as I get my first paycheck. Well, that was 2 years ago at this point, and I hadn't received the $300, and actually I'd forgotten about it. Probably been a year since I'd even thought about it. I thought about it every once in a while. I ran into a friend who'd come out of the house, but I'd written it off, okay? And you know, that was $300 gone, but it was a good cost. So now we're back to the actual tuck at the airport, and I said, fill it up. He said, okay, go to the office over there and grab a cup of coffee, and I'll be over as soon as I fill your plane. So Don Block and I walked to the office, poured ourselves a cup of coffee. In a few minutes, he strolled back over, and I just said a word, just walked through the office and went out the back door. I thought, well, that's probably the last I'll see him. He just pulled another Houdini on me, and I was wrong. A couple of minutes later, he came back with flopped $300 in Canadian money on the table in front of me. Now we're even. I looked at him and picked up the $300 and said, no, we're not even. We're not even for the $300. But we're not even for lying to me, you son of a bitch. I was going to swing on him, but he knew that. I mean, no, he knew what to start with. He backed off and told me. I reached down and grabbed a whole blanket. Let's go. I turned around and I said, oh, by the way, I used his name. Thanks for the gas charges to British Petroleum, if you can't afford it. And out the door he went and took off. That's the part I told you would be kind of hard to believe. In a country the size of Canada, I flew up and with no intention to find this guy. And the last thing I did, he actually paid me $300 in Canadian currency, which I don't know what exchange rate was, but it wasn't that good. I'm sure we made it up with the gas, because it would have been another $10, another $10 a gallon up there. So at any rate, I was pretty happy to be with the situation. And one more thing, I didn't have to nag at me throughout the situation. Although the situation wasn't nagging me anyway, excuse me again, anyway, we didn't feel like strolling around Tuktoyaktuk because the weather wasn't, wasn't that good. It was winter-like, but it wasn't really nice weather. It was snowing. So we fired up the Cessna 170 and headed back to Inuvik. Again, we made our little camp and went downtown and witnessed another fist fight or two. Got supper, came back, and Okay, what the hell are we going to do now? Well, it was a pretty good lake over fishing. What we're getting now? Well, we'd heard there was a pretty good lake trout fishing in a lake in there. So I strolled down to town and talked to people and ran into the captain of one of the research vessels that was doing research on the McKenzie River Delta, but not for, I figured out because they'd taken advantage of readings and they were doing. But anyway, we got to bullshitting over a beer and talked him into taking us out on a research vessel to cruise around the McKenzie River, and we'd give him a plane ride over the area to show him whatever he wanted to see. So anyway, that's how we spent the day. We took a cruise on a research vessel, looked at all the instruments and whatever, and didn't make any sense to me, but got a pretty good feel for the McKenzie River, and a huge river that flows straight north. Most rivers flow south. Anyway, gave him a ride wherever he wanted to go around the delta and surrounding areas and tundra and a few caribou whenever. And the next we met up cooking freeze-dried food over our campfire, and the next morning headed for a lake that he told us about 40 miles east of there. He said, good landing, good beach, no problem. So we took off and landed and fished for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours and never saw a fish, never got a bite, didn't say anything. So we came back to Newey, got in our camp next morning and said we'd go home. We plotted a course on an aviation map, not the way we'd come, not down the Arctic coast, but back straight south, but then go 100 miles to scope out the area and then head straight west for Fairbanks. Although we planned to stop at Fort Yukon in Alaska to gas up. Anyway, we took off on the map. Right in the middle of the map in our flight plan was a village called Old Crow on Porcupine River. I'd heard about Old Crow. A friend of mine, Chuck Gray, who'd hunted a lot up and took a lot of guides out that would go over Old Crow into Canada, where they hunt caribou at certain times of the year because they were known to be very large antlered caribou. Anyway, I thought it'd be cool. Let's go to Old Crow and check it out. So we had a couple hours to Old Crow, still in Yukon territory. We found the Porcupine River real easy and followed the Porcupine River until we got to the village. And there was a lot of timber in that country. So most of the natives, the Eskimos here, inland Eskimos, lived in log cabins because that was how they built their homes, and there wasn't any way to get a boat in there to bring things in like barge or something. So no roads, of course, hundreds of miles from any roads, so everything had to come by air or small boat. Anyway, they did their own thing with logs. So anyway, we landed and pulled off the runway to a nice secluded place, and as soon as we landed, there were probably a dozen little kids and maybe half a dozen older, adults, Eskimo peoples, right at our plane, which was not uncommon in the 60s when I flew northern Alaska because there was so little air traffic. They'd come out to visit and see get an apple or candy or something. Anyway, they all surrounded the airplane. We got out and made happy with them and gave them protein bars or candy bars or cigarettes. We didn't have any cigarettes, but anything we had, we passed out. The kids and several adults. At that time, a great big red-haired guy came out over, and he had the same kind of uniform on that a red mounting uniform or anything, but he had on a khaki-colored uniform, and introduced himself as the Rocky Mountain, or what do you call it, Mounted Police Division of Canada, Northwest Territories. He said, I'm in charge here. Well, hell, we were happy. We just shook his hand and smiled and said, how are you doing? He asked us all kinds of questions. Basically, we're on our way to Fairbanks, and we stopped here because we were tired of flying and we needed to park the plane, pour a little extra gas in it, maybe pitch a tent and cook a little dehydrated food. He said, okay. He stood straight up, walked all the way around the plane, drug his heel through the gravel, like pea gravel, all the way around, and came back up to us and said, do not leave that area. And he backed up to all the Eskimo kids and a couple of adults and says, back off. And boy, I mean, they did. And he said, you can set up your camp here. You will be out of here first thing in the morning. Do not cross that line I believe it. I mean, this guy was serious, and he was big, and he was burly, and he was mean looking. I said, we ain't crossing that line, and he was toting a gun, by the way. Of course, Mounties police did. And I mean, they never threatened us with a weapon or anything, but he didn't ask for our weapons, and I'm glad because we had weapons and would have made him look sick illegal in Canada. But anyway, he stomped off. The Eskimo kids and adults dribbled away too. It ain't the place to be. So at any rate, we went ahead and set up our little tent underneath the Cessna wing and tidbits we brought from the last restaurant. We got up early in the morning because we'd gone to bed early, and it was probably 5 or 6. Remember, in August, in the month, there was no darkness. So it's bright and it's light. We packed everything and went down to the other end and looked off and flew out low and slow over the village, which wasn't very big. I mean, the whole place didn't. They probably have 300 people, probably less than that. And there was one pretty good-sized log cabin over with a big Canadian flag on it, and I recognized that as Dudley Do-Right's cabin. So I flew low over it, and I came back. I did a chandelle or a turnaround and came back. But just as I got to the cabin, I pulled up real quick and popped down, like you pop a bunch of wolves when you're hunting, and went past it and came back. This time I came in more pop. I came in full bore, lined up with the cabin, and about, I was shooting maybe 10 or 20 feet above the cabin. I snatched up and popped him, and he was out on the porch. Now again, it might have been a little hard to fathom, but he was his red long johns. My God, I didn't even know they made them back then. Red long johns and a shotgun in his hand. He was probably, and it was obvious that the shotgun barrel was real long, and Blanc was hollering to get the hell out of there. So I popped him, and away we went. I mean, I'm not hoping that he shot at us, but he's waving the gun. I think if he'd done another pop, I probably would have blasted at us. But I didn't give him that chance. I just swung west and followed the Porcupine River down to Yukon, another 20 miles. Came out at Fort Yukon. We're in safe territory. We landed, filled up with gas, no problem. Everything was fine. Went back to Fairbanks. We're going to land and park the plane at Boughton Strip. When I radioed in to let them know I was in the airspace, I said, land on the East Strip, Fairbanks International. I said, no, I'm going to go to Boughton Strip on Fairbanks Farmers Loop. They said, land on the east ramp of Fairbanks International. Okay. So I went, flew another 3 miles or so and got into the landing pattern, did my downward, and came in and landed. There were 2 vehicles there. One was an American Customs, who had been turned in by the Mountie, who evidently had a 2 radio in Customs Canada and Northwest Territories, and said we were impinging on his rights and God, and I don't know what all he said. But anyway, those were guys questioning quite some detail, and it turned out they were starting laughing, and they're, hey, you guys, sorry to bring you in like that. Go ahead and take off, but go back to Boughton Strip. No reporting, no nothing. We never saw you, and this is honest to God truth. And I had eventually the same situation when I went back to Canada one time when I was flying an airplane up from America, when I'd violated some rules in Whitehorse, Alaska. And the Customs had met me, and it was the same kind of deal. The Canadians had demanded that Customs go, I don't know what, arrest me or fine me or shoot me or whatever. But it turned out to be a joke, and they laughed and laughed again. No report anyway. That was the cool end of a trip. That was 9 or 10 days of jam-packed adventure. Every inch of it was, and a lot of the adventure we brought on by ourselves by being arrogant and ugly Americans. But we left a lot of friends in the wake. This is the next episode of Donna and Jerry's Adventures in Alaska during the early days. This particular episode does not have Donna on it because she happens to be up in the Katmai fishing for big fish. But this is going to be with a friend of mine, Ross Harry, who is a bona fide pure coral mountain man in the Brooks Range, who spends his winters trapping on Nolan Creek and the summers hunting out of Wiseman, Alaska. And the summers spent with me traipsing around the Brooks Range drainages and mountaintops. He has he was a treasure, and he accepted me, and I'm glad of it, probably because we've been long friends and I've spent many summers there. Another reason that I think he respected my mountain ability and mountain lore, and probably more important, I had an airplane, which comes in handy once in a while. At any rate, this tale is quite complicated and convoluted. I'm going to work hard at trying to keep it in line with something you can understand and not get too overwhelmed with one of the episodes or another. But this particular summer, it had to be August, and it would have been somewhere in the middle 70s. I don't know. I don't keep that good of a journal. But we decided we were going to take a trip to a couple areas we'd never explored before, and we looking over from an airplane and picked out our routes and things, and a couple of the places he had been, so we were familiar with part of the journey. But basically it started in Wiseman, Alaska, and ended up in Bettles, Alaska, on a very tortuous route that we took. I airdropped a rubber raft and our camp gear on a sandbar on the Glacier River, which was about 7 miles or so west of Wiseman. We took off Wiseman with our packs, went to Nolan Creek, geared up a little bit more, fed ourselves, and went up over the pass and headed over the pass to the Glacier River. On the way to a ridge, Ross had a mining claim with Rose Quartz, which needed to do $100 worth of assessment work each year to validate it. So we stopped there and spent the night and did $100 worth of assessment work on it, which means he was shipping a chunk of rose quartz, which we didn't have a lot of value then, but we were hoping, and I was hoping, that maybe it would change and there would be more of a chance than just rose quartz. But anyway, we traveled the rest of the few miles down the Glacier River, where I dropped off our equipment, and at that point there was a trapper's cabin which was used many years ago. We settled in there for the night, blew up the boat, got our camp ready the next morning, and headed down the Glacier River on a warm summer day. And there wasn't a lot of runoff, and the river was very low. We could probably float 75% of the time. The rest of the time we kind of walked and drug it over the riffles, which was no big deal. Hell, but we did have weight all in the raft. We went downriver for about 2 miles, maybe twice that, and there was a little trickle coming off the hillside. He said, I was told by Harry Leonard there's a mining camp up there, so let's take a look. So we pulled the raft up and marched up this pretty damn steep hill or mountain. To most people, followed the little trickle creek up, and it broke into a flat area in a big relative meadow. There was a fantastically built cabin. I mean, it was much more than you'd expect in the Brooks Range backwoods. Another building, which obviously was their shop next to it, then a cache, which in Alaska, most camps had a small cabin built on top of a platform about 15 or 12 feet with poles sticking up, which went up to the cache, wrapped around the legs, so wolverines couldn't get in. And we look around, we found a ladder and a door and a little building on top of the log pile. It was partially open, so it was fair game. No way would I enter a cabin which was locked, or the shop which was locked. Obviously, people hadn't been there for several, or how many years, I don't know, but it was all pretty damn pristine shape. Went into the cache, and hanging from the ropes were a sack of oatmeal, flour, I don't know what else, in several cases of canned goods. Well, I spotted one box, and I opened it and found something I'd never seen before. Didn't even know until that time, but it was a whole case of canned butter, round pound cans of butter. Well, I didn't feel like taking anything from the camp, but I thought, hell, 2 cans of butter is not going to make me a thief. So I threw those in my pack and waited back down the hill. Ross and I had mentioned on our way down that sometimes we should come back there and mine with spoons or whatever in the crevices of this little creek, because there was gold above it. Obviously, they were mining it, and there was gold below it. It became because they had been mining down there a little bit. So I said maybe a lot of nuggets got stuck in the rocks going down. It made sense. We never did go back, but it was always in the back of my mind. At any rate, we did get back to our little raft, floated another 3 or 4 miles to a place where we were familiar with. It was on the west side of Blue Cloud Mountain, which could be readily seen from Wiseman, but we were on the other side of it now. And what was an old Norwegian, long since passed, and a great hunter, by the way, had built a very small cabin, because this was where he walked in from Wiseman to hunt Dall sheep. We'd been there before and hunted that area, so with great success. So he said, hey, let's camp here. We have some other things to do there anyway, so we could not enter the cabin because I had a chain on it, and it was And it was, the lure of the area was that there was a set gun inside. As the door was opened, it went off. That was enough to stop me, but I wouldn't have entered anyway because it had a chain on it, and I heard someone later found the set gun, and that's something they have to deal with. I don't. Not far from there was a little shelf that had sheets of slate, probably 2 feet wide and 6 feet high. We pulled them apart, we set up some logs, and used these sheets of shale to make a lean-to. And it was just cool as hell, man. I mean, let it rain or whatever, but in August it wasn't going to rain there. Anyway, this was our camp. Set up a little fire, meager amounts of food that we brought along, and spent the night. Morning we got up and traversed one of the 2 main canyons in Uchiradal sheep territory, and the first one didn't disappoint us. There was a 3/4 and a full ram right off the bat. We took him and a half curl right off the bat. We took him down and drug him back to camp, which wasn't any big deal. And I cut the back straps, and we were going to have a feast that night, and we did. In the meantime, Ross took a whole hind quarter off the sheep over to a little spring in the cabin, washed it off, packed it with mud. He came back to the campfire, dug a pretty good sized hole right next to it, placed flat rocks and campfire on the campfire with it. I didn't question him, I just watched him do it. At any rate, he dropped 2 or 3 big flat rocks down in this hole, threw some moss over the top, and laid the mud encrusted an inch or 2 of mud on it down on top of the moss. Took several more flat rocks that he brought up from the river over the top of it and covered the whole damn thing with dirt. And he dug out the hole and said, "This will be our supper for the next few days." Yeah, okay, Ross. Anyway, we ate backstraps and enjoyed them, spent another night in camp, BSing like we always do. Harry Leonard told me there was a couple ponds on top of Snowshoe Pass, and one or more of them had northern pike in them. I hadn't heard this, but anyway, Ross had, so he said, so let's go up and take a look. So went back down the river, back up the river for about a half a mile to the base of Snowshoe Pass, which is over the top down into the middle fork of the Koyukuk. So we trekked up there. It didn't take long. It was no big deal. I always carried a breakdown fly pole with several lures and a bunch of flies. And I had that, and away we went. We got to this little pond, and I mean, it was a small pond, but it was deep because if it was frozen to the bottom, of course, the fish would be gone. Maybe they survived it. But anyway, there was this pond about the size of 2, maybe 3 houses. Not a big pond at all. And I saw some action along the edges of the rocks. I rigged up the pole, put a red and white daredevil there in the middle, and the whole pond went in a frenzy. Hooked a pipe, reeled it in, and a bunch of pipe followed with it. I brought it in, always kept a little 1/4 inch retractable tape in my pocket because I like to measure the horns of the sheep we killed, 26 inches long, which is not a big pike, but it was respectable. And you have to remember that pike have lots of bones, so the last third of their body is all notochord, not a backbone. So at least a third of this pike was going to be some good eating along with the sheep we had. Anyway, threw the daredevil in and same thing out. A big flurry, caught 10 fish. He did the same thing. And he tried it. He pulled another 10 in. Each time the flurry was smaller and hard to believe, but I didn't care. If you believe it or not, I was there. I believe it. He handed the pole back to me, and I kept bringing fish in. There was flopping all around us, and finally he got down to where there wasn't a flurry. I cast out again, and the fish hit it. I brought it in, threw it out again, and nothing. We'd actually caught every fish in the pond, and they're all exactly the same size. What they were doing was living in there, but they didn't have a lot to eat, so they were eating their young. There was no hopes of any progeny surviving. So anyway, we looked at all the fish and said, "Ross, how do you tell a male from a female?" He said, "Hell, I don't know, man." So we picked out 4 just by guessing they were still flopping easily and turned them back in, hoping that they would revitalize the pond. And we cut the third of the fish and pike off, and our packs went down the hill to our raft, floated back to camp with 20 parts of pike on our backs. So I skinned them, fleshed them, and Ross went to burying, too busy increasing the drying rack, which we had a sheet metal hanging on, drying under a small fire, smoking. I set the pike and flays on the drying rack, so the day was getting close to over by then. So Ross said, let's eat some sheep meat. We're already eating the backstraps. Okay, we're going to eat mud now. I went digging, pulled this thing out, knocking the mud off, cleaned it off, brought it back. Looked fantastic. We set up stump, carved into big steaks. Butter smeared on the steaks, put another steak on top of it. Had sheep sandwiches, and it was the best sheep I've ever eaten, and that is one hell of a good way to cook. I don't know how I learned. I don't know if they made it up or somebody talked about it, but cooking in buried mud or tinfoil or anything, just mud and hot rocks and a fire on top of it, but that was ours, and it was our supper, and it would be our supper for the next couple of nights. At any rate, next day we kind of lounged around smoking and drying our fish, drying our sheep meat. Next day we decided it was time to move, so we loaded up dried meat, much is going to be in preserved for a few days, and Ross said, I'm going to go over Snowshoe Pass and drop into the Middle Fork, Koyukuk, because I haven't been in that area before. Why don't you take the raft and go down the rest of the Glacier River, and I'll meet you where it confluences with the Koyukuk. That sounded good to me. So anyway, later in the morning, it was probably late in the morning, Ross took off walking up the river past the pond we'd fished and over the top. And I lowered the raft away and went. Now, next thing I'm going to tell you again, borders on hard to believe, but it was part of an adventure, and I'm telling you, and I've had plenty of adventures, so I don't need to make them up. Anyway, here we go. I'm slowly drifting down the river, one leg hanging out, bouncing off the bottom, keeping the raft pointed in the right direction, hitting a riffle once in a while, dragging over, and probably it was 3 miles or more down to the confluence. Going maybe half that distance, and I looked up ahead on a little gravel bar with grass growing up to the edge of it. There's wolves behind it with a damn half-grown wolf sitting there like a dog looking at me. He couldn't figure out what I was, and I couldn't figure out what the hell was what he was doing sitting there. But anyway, I'm probably 30 yards from at that point, so I dropped the leg and stopped the raft. We sat staring at her while he made a couple of yips, and then another three-quarter grown pup came out of the willows and went over and stood next to him, both yipping, and another, and pretty soon there's 5 wolves, young wolves, standing in this little gravel bar with grass on it, yipping. One of them's trying to howl, but he's not old enough to howl really, but he tried. I'm sitting there going, holy Moses, I am, this is unbelievable. I mean, I've killed a lot of wolves. I've been hunting wolves for years, but I've never seen anything like this. Out of the corner of my eye up the river, on a straight stretch up there, came around the bend, a long straight stretch, I saw something caught my eye, and I focused on my attention. About 150 yards away up the bank was a big wolf, and it looked white. It turned out it wasn't pure white, it had gray strips running down the back, and some on the belly. At any rate, this wolf is in high gear and rushing down the bank of the river. And the little wolves, they hadn't seen it yet. They were too interested in me and doing their yipping thing. But I'm focused on this damn big dog running straight at me. So I'm fussed around. I figure I need to get a little bit of protection. So I fussed around until I found a 12-gauge shotgun that I always carry on these kind of trips, and sawed off model 970 rat gun. Anyway, this wolf, when she got about 40 yards, I could see her hair flowing across her body, across the top of her neck. I grabbed the gun up, pointed at her, because if she came straight at me and jumped at me in the raft, I was going to have to kill her. I definitely didn't want to, because a summer wolf hide is worthless. Anyway, it would not have been fair to these pups, but she didn't. She jumped in the river right in front of my boat and didn't have to swim because it was too shallow. She's running at top speed, actually, because it was going so fast, the water actually splashed up into my glasses. That's how close she was when she crossed in front of the boat. She hit the other bank, grabbed the first wolf pup, and threw him up in the air probably 6 feet. Down he came, thump. The rest of them just scattered for the willows. And after them she went. I looked at the willows, probably 4 or 5 feet tall, and then another wolf flew up in the willows and came down. Then was yipping and howling and screaming, and all of a sudden, not a sound. She'd done her thing. She'd done her punishment trip, and now she was in full shut-up mode. I sat in the boat, and I'm just amazed. I mean, I'm awed by the whole situation, my sense, focus, listening, and there was nothing. Not a squirrel, not a bird. I couldn't hear anything. Dead silence, but she had laid down and told him what to do. And I probably sat there with my leg on the water for another 5 minutes, just going, holy mackerel, what have I just seen? At any rate, let's write that one up. I'm going to tell people, but nobody's going to believe me anyway. So maybe I won't tell anyone. I let my foot and slowly drifted down after I'd pulled my foot up. My mind was actually focused on this beautiful almost white Arctic wolf running down the bank, hitting the water, and watching those little babies squeal. Anyway, eventually another hour or two, time it didn't make any difference. Up there, it never got dark, so nothing made much difference. But eventually, I got down to Confluence where the middle fork of the Koyukuk was running. And it was running pretty good. In fact, it's a pretty good sized major river. So it was no problem running into it and figure out, getting back down to Bettles from there would be a dream compared to going down Glacier River. So I pulled up and started a little fire and made some tea, and about half an hour or an hour later, here comes Ross walking down the bank. Our rendezvous worked. We sat there and drank tea and looked through it for a while, and he said, okay, next step is Mini Creek. I knew what he was talking about because I'd seen it on my maps, and we discussed it. But some old-timer had run into it, another old-timer, and told him prospecting on Winnie Creek, a small little tributary to the Koyukuk, and said it was supposedly big grayling there, 18-inch grayling on Winnie Creek. Well, I mean, I was psyched up since the trip because I had never caught an 18-inch grayling. So it's going to be my time. So we launched the boat, went across the river, and no problem, 2 miles or so, whatever. I don't remember the mileage, and we came to this little creek flowing in, and that's Winnie Creek. Pulled up, dug our camp gear to timber, set up a camp. I immediately unloaded my backpack and blew Dunfon and went to fishing. It was a beautiful little creek. Riffle every hole. Every hole I caught 3 or 4 fish, but I would say 15 inches. Well, I'd say because I measured them, and they got any bigger than that. But I'd fished for a long time and caught a lot of fish, enough to well-earned grayling to feed that night. In the morning we went again and tried, and there was no 18-inch grayling in there. So, okay. It was a try anyway. We had a nice camp there, and while I was fishing, Ross and I looked across the river, and the river had a big, was a mountain, but there was a great knob of tundra on it, and it was a white object above that, some cliffs. So it was obviously a Dall sheep, so we're now focused on getting to Bettles because the Windcook thing didn't work out. And we had a nice little trip, but anyway, we decided to break camp, cross the river, crawl up the mountain, take a Dall sheep down and bring it into Bettles with us, and trade it for a flight back to Wiseman, or wherever we could, or give it away to somebody. We both knew people there. I knew the teacher really well, and I also knew the FA really well too, the FAA guy. Anyway, we crossed the river, put on some light backpacks and our guns, and took off. We got up and looked over at this little ridge, and here was a 3/4 inch ram. There's only one sheep I knew pretty much that it was a ram because it was a ewe. She'd been other ewes or young ones. Anyway, the ram saw us, and he was down below us at this point. So he started moving up the hill. He didn't know who we were or what we were. He'd never seen a man before, but he was. His object was to get to the cliffs, which was what they do, and that was where they were safe. Well, that was easy sheep meat, and it was a leisurely trip downriver, a few miles to Bettles, and our adventure was closed. Well, this is the next episode of the Donna and Jerry episodes. And this one, Donna isn't along. This one involves Jerry, me, and Jim Godot, a longtime friend of mine and a fellow pilot, fellow plane owner. And he wanted to go over into the Koyukuk River, which I had been to before, but he hadn't. But I was totally willing to go because it's great country and just a long ways away. At any rate, it was probably around the 1st September because moose season was on and open or nearly open, and we were going to go for a big fish and perhaps a bull moose. But anyway, I think it was probably middle 80s. We geared up and went straight north out of Fairbanks, him in a float plane, a Champ on floats, and me in my big wheeled Satabria. And we went first to Bettles, and then hour and 45 minutes straight north, fueled up, picked up a few odds and ends, and headed basically straight west across the Koyukuk River, the John River, the Itkillik River, and a couple more. But another hour and a half were the first glimpse of the Kobuk River. We were a long ways north and a long ways west from where we started, right off the bat, and we were on the upper part of the Kobuk, certainly right off the bat. And I spotted a really nice gravel type bar on the Kobuk. I landed, and shortly after Jim landed on floats right next to me. We set up a little camp, drank a few beers, settled in for the night. We took off with Jim's float plane. We went downriver and we could see large groups of fish, maybe 100 to 200 in each group, headed upstream to spawn in Walker Lake. At any rate, we picked up a nice big bunch, landed right in front of them, jumped out, grabbed our spinning outfits, and with big white and red daredevils, and once the mass of fish reached us, we'd get one every cast. Bam! And I would say they averaged in weight from 15 to 40 pounds. About one out of every 3 of these big fish would feel the pressure on him, and when he set the hook, he came straight at the pressure. Now you're standing there in water up to your thighs. There's a fish coming straight at you. Non-monofilament line is piling up in front of you. The fish gets up 10 feet from you. It sees you, jumps in the air, and occasionally, with all the slack, spit the lure, and it would go zinging by your head. Hopefully by your head. Anyway, that fish was lost because he'd take off and hit all that slack, and he was gone. Anyway, we caught all the dang fish we wanted and kept a couple. Turned everything else loose. And then went to another bunch just for the fun of it. Caught more fish, played around, went back to camp, and had a wonderful meal of great sheefish. We filleted one that was 40 pounds, and it definitely took care of us because I was looking at 20 pounds of fillets, and it was much more than we could eat. A couple of cases of beer, and we were good for the night. Next morning, we got up, had breakfast, and did the same thing. Went downriver, found a bunch of sheefish, waded into them, and simply repeated it. Next day we noticed we were running out of beer. It wasn't what we were going to do, so we hopped in my Satabri and flew an hour and a half back to Bettles, picked up 2 cases of Bud Light, and came back and had a party. Next day we said we'd go fishing, but we'd also be looking for a moose. We hadn't seen one along the river yet, but we hadn't been much on the river. We took off and cruised around a little bit, and luck would have it, on a beautiful day, there's a nice, very young bull and a slough that met up with a koyakuk on them, a big slough, and this was standing right on the edge of it in the water, just looking at us. Jim feathered the prop, cruised around, landed, and taxied up to within, I'm guessing, 75 yards of the moose. He stood there looking at us. What's that yellow plane doing here? So I grabbed my 300, jumped out in the strut, and as soon as the plane stopped, put my barrel across the strut, about ready to fire, and said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot, don't shoot." Well, the prop hadn't quit swinging yet. If I'd have shot, there's a good chance I would have put a hole in the prop. But that was my hunting excitement. I did simmer down, wait for the prop to stop, made a headshot in the moose. Down he went. We taxied right up to him, poked him with the floats, dressed him, broke him in about 7 chunks, put as much as Jim could haul. He had a pretty light powered airplane, so he couldn't pick up a lot, probably half or less than half of the moose. And he flew back to our camp, dropped it off. Came back, picked up another load, dropped off, came back and picked me up. Thank goodness. We spent the rest of the day preparing that meat. We had broke down pretty good. We cleaned up in the water and tagged up in some game bags and took it over to the timber on the edge of the sandbar and hung it up. Then we decided things were going to have moose liver and beer, so that's what we did, exactly. Anyway, next morning we didn't get up early because we stayed more than Hunter's Camp usually does. I'd never been to Walker Lake, which is the head of the Kobuk River. The sheefish winter in Kotzebue Sound, and in the spring they all not like salmon. They don't die when they spawn. They go up in and swim all over the Kobuk River and then spend the rest of the year in Walker Lake where they spawn. In the spring, they turn their young ones downriver. But anyway, I hadn't been to Walker Lake and took off on my right angle for our camp. Kobuk River pulls pretty much east and west, but it makes a sharp angle 30 miles up at this point. Very rough river because it's dropping off awful fast. We see Walker Lake, which is a big lake, 4 miles wide and 15 miles long. You can check that on Google, but that was my first impression. We flew over Walker Lake and noticed 3 or 4 bunches of Canadian geese. Each had a big adult and half dozen to 6 or 8 young ones swimming along. So Jim buzzed them, and the young ones could fly, but they couldn't fly much. They just kind of skimmed over the water. And they weren't like the ones on the Kobuk, which I mentioned earlier, where they all headed for the brush. They had a lot of water to ski on. So he stopped the airplane and dug out his survival gun, which every bush pilot in Alaska carries. It was a Stevens 20 gauge 22 Magnum over and under. So I got out, grabbed a few 20 gauge shells, tied my belt to the strut and stood on the float and said a prayer or two because Jim's kind of a wild man. And away we went. The young geese could get up and fly about 3 or 4 feet off the water, and Jim would pull up to one and I'd shoot it, pull up to another one, I'd shoot it, swing around. Finally, anyway, we shot 4 of these 3/4 to 3/4 grown up geese. So we dabbled around there and picked all 4 of them and went back to camp. We had a beer, young geese, and a real celebration. We'd been there 5 days, and I guess long enough. We had a lot of moose meat to take back, so I decided the next morning to get up and catch another couple fish to take home, a couple big ones, stuff them in and float, come back, pick up our moose meat in camp, and head back to Bettles. Gas up and back to Fairbanks. So that's what we planned, and that's what we actually did in the long run. What I haven't mentioned is that I did mention I'd been to the Kobuk before, 2 or 3 years before. We'd flown into the Kobuk to catch sheepfish because they were all kinds of mythical thing about Jeff Copeland. I'd ever caught one, and he had a Cessna 180 on floats. So we flew up the Kobuk and spent 4 days there catching sheepfish. The last day we were there, he loaded up because we were greedy, I guess, and he was dumping the fish into the side of the floats, and I was dumping them on my side. We finally decided, hey, that's enough. We started turning some loose, and time to go home. So Jeff and I in his 180 and our sheepfish took off downriver because that's the way the slight wind was coming from, and there's curves in the Kobuk. We just couldn't get up enough airspeed to pick up a float. So we spun around, and we thought we'd go upstream because it's a little more friction on the floats, a little less friction on the floats. And the way we went full bore, no way, we couldn't make it. Couldn't get up enough speed. So we ended up on the last curve to fly the plane into the willows. There was some big boulders, rocks there. Not boulders, big rocks, and they were banged and clanged and boomed. Once we got shed of the surface tension of the water and the rocks and the willows, we got airborne. Hey, we're cool, we're good. So we flew 3 hours back to Fairbanks, landed at Fairbanks International Float Pond. On my side, there were 4 sections, and 3 of the sections were ripped up because Jim said, or what his face said, was that he was pulling off a little bit to the right. Anyway, we landed on the float pond, and immediately the right float sucked up all the water and filled the float up, and down we went. Down the wing went, down the prop went, and we sank right there in the float pond. Luckily, it wasn't like really deep. It was a big lake or something. Anyway, it sunk the plane, and we swam out, and kind of like riding a bicycle. I remember quick on my way out to the side of the airplane because my side was down. Anyway, that was my other experience with the Kobuk River. Great fishing, piss poor landing. Anyway, Jim and I took off with our fish, what was left of the geese, maybe 1 piece, and the moose meat and whatever we had. Went back to Bettles, gassed up, said hi to a couple friends, my old buddy Rudy Green, Ron Costello, and headed to Fairbanks. Split up the meat, split up the fish, split up the geese. Had a wonderful trip back to Fairbanks. Fantastic Kobuk River Valley. Welcome back to the next episode of Alaska Adventures with Jerry and Donna. Again, this one doesn't include Donna, but it does include Jerry and a cast of other customers, which also includes several law officers. At any rate, it's toward the end of 1970s, the end of August, and I've just spent the summer, as usual, up in the Brooks Range with Ross Harry, hunting and exploring and doing a little prospecting, mainly exploring the interior of the Brooks Range. It's time for me to go. I've got to get back on work for September, so I'm thinking of the mail plane that comes in once every week or two. Wiseman, 2 days before that, when we were up on mining claim on Nolan Creek, I shot a large gray wolf, but it was a summer wolf, so the hide wasn't really any good, but there was a $50 bounty on wolves if you skinned it out and left the left ulna bone attached to the skin. So I did all that, wrapped it up, and walked the 8 miles with my gear down to Wiseman. The plane was coming in the next day, so Ross and I said goodbye. I said goodbye to 2 old miners that lived there in Wiseman, and threw my sleeping bag out in the grass the runway and waited. Waited for tomorrow, and tomorrow came, and Shaky Shanahan from Bettle's Flying Service came in. He landed, and I threw my stuff in, and away we went back to Bettle's. Now once there was a weekly wean Air Alaska Twin Otter that came into Bettle's to deliver supplies and mail. It was going to be my ride home, but I had to wait another day, which wasn't bad. I had friends to stay with finally, and came away, and I went and I was looking pretty rough. I'd been up in the range all summer, and had a beard and long hair and real crusty clothing, and that was all I had. So at any rate, I got on the Otter, and we landed in Fairbanks. I went to the nearest telephone and called my friend Les Wheel to see if he'd come down and pick me up. Because at that time I lived in Seward, Alaska, he was at work. But he said, hey, hang on a little while, and I'll eventually be there. And pretty soon he did come, and he said, I'll take you home. I said, oh no, I need to get down and take care of this bounty bone wolf before it's starting to not smell too good. He took me to his house and turned me over to his Honda 90 little motorcycle. I said, I'll meet you when I'm ending my shift, and we'll go from there. So I threw my gear in his house, grabbed the wolf hide, and hopped on the Honda and went down to the courthouse. 3-story building. I knew the bottom floor was law enforcement, fish and feathers and all that. So when I went, I just proud as I could be. With this rolled up wolf hide, and walked in. Gentlemen, I'd like to claim a bounty on this wolf. One guy looked at me kind of funny, and he said, okay. So he untied the hide, rolled it out, saw the bone was attached to where it should be, and then he said, okay, you just need to fill out this one form. So I filled out the form, name, address, area, wolf kill, and date of kill, which was about, 4 or 5 days earlier before that. So as soon as I wrote the date down, he snatched the paper off the desk and said, you're under arrest. I said, oh shit, man, why am I under arrest? And he said, well, in July, the wolf was taken off the predator list and made a big game animal, and that gave it a season to hunt, and August is not that season. So you see, you violated the law. I said, well, I thought I was doing a favor because it was a bounty on wolves. I would have been up in the Brooks Range for several months, had no way I could get knowledge that the status of the wolf had changed since then. I said, and ignorance is no excuse. So you're under arrest. So he started filling out paperwork and got on the phone and called up somebody and then said, you're in luck. You're not going to have to file a bond to go to jail. You get to go directly to court on the 3rd floor. Judge Schaefermeyer just finished up another poaching case, and we'll be up there, and you'll be next. Up the stairs we went. He's carrying the wolf and the paper that I signed. We entered the courtroom. A little hard to believe. Believe me, it was happening. Judge Schaefermeyer, whom I knew from past experience, had a great big tall lanky hippie standing in front of what happened. That somebody had killed a moose, and they had a commune out on Chena Pump Road, and they had a moose hanging up there. And a fish and game guy, somehow they got word of it, and he was a fish and game guy about 100 yards off or more behind some brush, taking pictures of the dead moose and waiting for somebody to walk up and start working on it. So they have evidence that what they needed. Well, the hippies were pretty smart hippies, and they noticed this. So they set up a cardboard box with halfway between the moose and where the guy was lying, taking his pictures. And they started target practice. Well, pretty soon, this guy actually, real soon, decided it wasn't a safe place for him. Jumped up and ran. Anyway, they had people waiting, and they arrested the leader of the hippie pack, which was this big, tall guy. Anyway, she was questioning him back and forth, shaking his head and finally said, okay, who put that moose there? And hippie leaned back a little bit and said, God? Man, she slammed her gavel down and said, you are guilty. Case dismissed. Or whatever else we've got here. Take him away. They had some holding cells, I don't know where, but somewhere around. Anyway, he was gone, and she whacked the damn gavel again and said, okay, next. I looked down at the subpoena and said, Jerry Meringue versus State of Alaska. The fish and feathers guy explained the situation to her, brought the wolf right up to her, What do you have to say? I said, well, I said, according to the information you have in front of you, I'm guilty. However, it doesn't matter. However, you're guilty. $500. Take him away. And so I said, well, I've got the money. I'll pay you. Well, because I did. I didn't look like it. He says, okay. So now two officers, not fishing game, two officers came up and didn't handcuff me, but they said they'd take me to the accountant. I paid the $500 and they let me go. So until I'm free, I don't have $500. I don't have anything, but at least I'm not in jail. And I would have been if I hadn't had the money. So anyway, I went down and got one of the officers, escorted me out to the building to where the Honda 90 was. And when I crawled on it and kick-started it, fired up, he said, well, so I did. He said, let me see your driver's license. Well, they'd already had my driver's license, so I on top of my billfold, I showed it to him. Now, show me registration for this. I said, I don't have registration for it because it's not mine. Oh, you stole the motorcycle. A friend of mine loaned it to me, and he shut it off and followed me back to the first floor of the police station. Says, hey, you need to call Les Wheel and tell him I told him we worked, and they looked this number up, and individual here with a nice motorcycle. It's Honda 90. He said, it's yours. And she loaned it to him. And that Les Wheel said over the phone, I couldn't hear this, but I heard the officer told me, oh man, I'm glad you found my stolen bike. And you got the guy that took it. Yes. He laughed like hell, and then he said, no, I'm just kidding. I'll be right down. So anyway, he came down, and all is well except my pride. He gave the cops the okay. I climbed on the Honda, and he followed me back to his house, changed clothing, cleaned up. Well, that's about the end of the story. And my next move was to get on another Alaska Airlines and go to Anchorage, and then have Donna pick me up in Seward. Okay, the next episode. This one involves Jerry and Donna and 1-year-old daughter Brandy in a mining camp in the Brooks Range, 275 miles north of Fairbanks. It's getting toward the end of the summer, probably around the end of August. During the normal days of summer, we had 3 or 4 splashes of water, that is, hydraulic blasts into the gravel to run through our sluice boxes. But as the summer wore on and the water became less and less available, we're down to maybe 1 splash a day, which gave me time to do other things and pick rocks and wash through the sluice boxes. My first project was a log sauna, which we built. My next project was a cache. And a cache, for those who don't know, is a year-round, it is in most year-round cabins. The owner will build a small log building on top of something probably 12 to 15 feet high, then wrap the bottom with stilts and tin so that animals, wolverines, squirrels, grizzly bears, whatever cannot climb up and get into the cache, because that's where you keep your meat for the winter and other perishables that can stand to be frozen. At any rate, I was working on a cache and had the 4 15-foot legs up on a platform built that I was working on, a couple of logs that I had brought up to start the base of the little cabin. Everything was going fine. It was a beautiful fall day, and I could hear some noises coming from the cabin, which was probably about, I'd say, 60 feet away, and the noises I heard were my predator call. Now, Brandy, excuse me, being raised in the wilderness, didn't have many toys or things to play with and lived alone. I mean, as far as other kids go, her main source of amusement was crawling through cardboard boxes that brought our food up, or sitting in front of the cabin talking to camp robbers and squirrels and playing with the dog. At that time, though, we didn't have a dog, because about a week before that, our husky Kobuk got into a serious confrontation with a porcupine. Being hours away by airplane from a vet, I ended up having to put the dog down. So that time we didn't have a dog, so Brandy wasn't playing outside, all for safety, because there's a lot of dangerous animals around. Anyway, I was listening to her brother this predator call, kind of grinning, wondering how long it would take Donna to have enough of it and take it away from her. I looked down, and sitting like a dog on its haunches, looking into the screen door, was a great big gray wolf just sitting there looking in. Unbelievably, Brandy had called that wolf in with that predator call, which is something I had a hard time doing. But anyway, that's the way it turned out, and I thought, okay, boy, oh boy, this is a dilemma. What am I going to do? I didn't have a gun up there with me. I had a hammer and some tools. I'll throw the hammer at him. I'll crawl down the ladder and run at him. None of that made a whole lot of sense. I was thinking about it. Kaboom! I heard the rack of that .350 Magnum of Donna's go off. The wolf flew through the air about 10 feet and rolled another 10 feet and was definitely dead. She came out with a gun holding up to the wolf, and I crawled down it quick as I could and found the wolf was dead and held it up, and you could see through the hole she'd blown through the wolf. So that really was the adventure that I wanted to impart to you, Donna killing a wolf. And that 1-year-old Brandy called in with a predator call and was definitely if Brandy had been outside blowing that predator call, it would have been a much worse situation to arise. But anyway, that's what it was. That's what happened. Now I've got a little sidebar to that. Some people basically would say, while Brandy would play outside, she would eat dirt. And while she'd come in, she'd have dirt all around her lips and on her tongue. And it bothered us. And we discussed it quite a bit. Maybe I should take her to town, which is really a big production. But then I remembered that I knew the medicine woman from Manitowoc Pass, an Eskimo woman named Florence Jonas, who I knew happened to be in Wiseman at the time, taking care of her cabin there also. So I thought, let's try Mrs. Jonas and see if she can shed some light on the situation. That made us quite nervous. Although Brandy was totally healthy, a roly-poly 1-year-old that could run and walk to some extent, but she ate dirt. So at any rate, I flew to Wiseman, just down the river about 12 miles, a little old mining camp that had 2 old-timers living there, and occasionally Mrs. Jonas. At any rate, I landed, went over to Mrs. Jonas' cabin and told her, and I knew her slightly, and we talked for a minute, and I explained the situation. She said, "Oh, Jerry, you got baby so good." I said, "Yeah, but baby, I don't know, baby eating dirt," and said, "Well, let's go see baby." So she got in my plane, we flew back to the mining camp, and as soon as she got in the house, she went over and sat down in a chair, looked at Brandy, Brandy looked at her, and Brandy just ran up to old Mrs. Jonas, I mean old, and climbed upon her lap. And those two bonded instantly. They talked back and forth in Eskimo and 1-year-old. Whatever they were saying, smiling, I think I communicated, but anyway, I got through with the niceties and finally said, "Okay, you say baby eat dirt." And I said, "Baby eats dirt." She said, "Baby eat lots of dirt?" I said, "Yeah." She looked at me, smiled, and said, "Good baby. Baby needs some things we don't feed them, so they eat dirt to get those things. Good baby." That's the end of the story, except I loaded Mrs. Jonas back in the airplane and asked if she wanted, and threw a hindquarter, asked her what she wanted, threw a hindquarter of meat in her lap, and asked her if she wanted me to fly her down to the pass, which was a long ways away, and she said no. Shaky Shanahan picked me up tomorrow, take me home. So I flew her back to Wiseman, dropped her off, thanked her. That's basically the end of my story and my anecdote that followed it up. Well, this is another episode of Donna and Jerry's Wilderness Adventures. Or I think in this case I would probably say, without doubt, a misadventure. This was about one of those wild trips we took that things didn't go right from the beginning. In the end, everything in between. It was many, many, many mistakes and a pretty miserable trip. But anyway, I think it warrants telling, rather than bragging about all our successful adventures, throwing in one that was successful and that was created a hard time for us. Well, we're living in Fairbanks. The date was somewhere in the 70s, probably 74. And we were after brown bear, or a pair of brown bears, which on the coast of Alaska at a place called Hitchinbrook Island, which is one of the 2 major big islands in Prince William Sound area, known for having a good population of big grizzly brown bears. So I did a little research and came up with a bush pilot of Cordova by the name of Wayne Smith. He was the son of a quite famous or infamous bush pilot named Mudhole Smith. He received that name honorably, and that's another story too. But anyway, at this time, the late Mudhole Smith and his son, the late Mudhole Smith and his son Wayne had taken over the flying service out of Cordova. So I made arrangements for us to meet us in Valdez on a certain date. Now that was 300 or 400 miles from Fairbanks, so we had pretty much of a day of travel just to get to the airplane, but eventually we did. and it was a pretty decent day. We got to fly over Prince William Sound and the beginnings of the Chugach Range. It was quite beautiful, actually. Flew Montague Island and then landed on Hitchenbrook Island and circled around the big bay a little until we picked out a place we wanted to camp. After we landed, it was a Cessna 180 or 85. I'm not sure which. Probably 185. And he pulled up to the shore and bumped into the gravel, and you can see the water was deep there. It wasn't a shallow bay. We bailed out and crawled onto the floats or pontoons and started unloading the gear. Well, the first cardboard box Wayne got a hold of it and stepped out off the pontoons, and he tripped and went straight to the bottom. He went straight to the bottom, and I looked down, and I was standing on a float also, and I saw that his hat was floating on top of the water. Eventually his arm came up and his head came up, and I dragged him out. We lost a box, one of our boxes of supplies, which was dehydrated food and some cooking stuff. At any rate, that's how our trip started. Before we even got on shore, we lost a lot of our gear. We did get the tent and sleeping bags and the rest of our stuff up on the bank. Waved bye to Wayne Smith, and he took off. So we set up camp, did a little excursion around before it got dark, which it didn't get dark much, and made it back to camp. Set up our sleeping bags. Cooked a nice little supper of dehydrated potatoes and peas or whatever. Went to bed. Next morning during the night, it started raining. And it rained hard for 10 days straight. Now, we had a good tent. We had good water covering for it, but the air was wet, and even everything inside the tent was damp and musky. And that's the way we were. We were stuck and spent a lot of time in that tent, grumbling and reading paperback books and trying to cook wet frozen food. And anyway, one day, a couple of days after we'd been there and after we'd got to go out and do a downpour or do nothing, we ventured out and went to the bay and came up with a sitka deer, a lone sitka deer that was feeding on some grass at the edge of the bay. Now, sitka deer are very small. They're not unlike a whitetail, only they're a lot smaller. It takes a pretty good average one to make 100 pounds. At any rate, that sounded pretty good from our eating dehydrated recreational co-op food, so we set about a stalk, and we got close enough, and Donna pulled out her .350 Magnum, lit a fire in the barrel, and blew the deer down. I mean, his feet hit the ground before anything else. His feet hit the air before anything happened, and his back came down and hit, but anyway, it was a fast, quick kill. I walked up to it, and she'd put that .350 round right behind the shoulder, and like she should, but there was a hole. I put my fist through and didn't touch anything on either side. So Donna came over, grabbed a hold of it, picked it up, and I took a picture of her face through the hole in that deer. I mean, that may sound gross to you. I'm just telling you the way it was. We had a good smile over that. Mainly, we had some fresh meat, which was good because there was no hell where anything see anything but no ducks, geese, or anything. Our seals, we could have made stock on, provided some meat for us. We had food okay, but nice to have some fresh meat anyway. We butchered that deer and took it back to camp and broke it down to chunks. Did our best to preserve what we didn't eat, but first thing was to eat the back straps and some choice chops, and felt a little bit better, although wet and soggy and damp. And the cooking was interesting because all we had was a 1-burner backpack stove and a little round thing. We had a 2-burner Coleman, but it went down bottom with Wayne Smith and some other stuff. So our cooking was limited, and this was happy to have it, by the way. I don't even know why we had it packed, but we did, and that's what we cooked the meat with. And again, a few days of misery, peeking out and wondering a little bit, coming back, drying out, trying to find out. After a week or so, we decided it was time at least to make a venture out to walk around the bay on the edge of the ocean, I'd say for 2 miles, and I don't know what we were looking for at that point because I really couldn't see a bear, but they were kind of exploring and picking up odds and ends off the water's edge. We decided we'd go back. We go back well being inlanders. We didn't really understand tides and all that, but the tide was coming in, so by the time we started back, we walked back the way a great cliff that went high as you could see, and I couldn't see the end of it. So we got to that point where the water tide had come in and obscured our walk back to this huge shelf of rock. We had several choices. One, we could climb up over the top of the cliff, which I couldn't see the top of, as I mentioned, or we could stay the night After the tide went out, I didn't have any idea when that would be. I guess 12 hours. But we could climb along the edge of the cliff, and that's what we chose to do. But it was really an interesting, scary experience because we were not rock climbers, and we were not rock climbers at that point, climbing a cliff 20 or 30 feet above the ocean, which you're looking down at, which is slapping waves against the base of the cliff, which is worse. We were walking anyway. I don't know how to make it sound fearful, but it was damn fearful. So anyway, we finally decided we had to jump a couple crevices, which is okay. It's like either sit there overnight with the bears or make it back to camp with the rest of our munitions. We're well away, and we finally made it back and suffered through a few more days. We got to where our pickup date was still no relief from the weather. You couldn't see 400 or 500 feet across the bay, or 200 yards across the bay. The rain was pouring down, and the plane obviously didn't come in on the date it was supposed to. It was only 2 days after that we got up in the morning, and it was peak of blue through the sky. The sky looked like it was going to be, hey, this is going to be a pickup day. So in fact, he did, but it still was not a bear in my mind. I wanted a damn brown bear, so I left Donna and started breaking camp down, at least somewhat, taking a tent down and anything but breaking it down in case it didn't show up. Didn't want it all broken down. I walked up this little point, probably 200 feet above sea level, and looked across the bay, and I walked up there, and lo and behold, there were 2 brown bears that had been down on the beach, were now working their way back into the timber. Where the timber is timber, I mean heavy-duty, dense timber. Lots of alders, and to go through those alders like breaking out of jail. The only way you can get through them is to follow a bear trail. At any rate, these 2 bears were getting close to going out of sight. I laid down and leveled my smoke pole in their direction, and the first bear had already gone into the timber. Second bear was ambling behind him, about to go in. I put my crosshairs on him, and son of a gun, I did a lot of thinking in that multi-seconds that happened. If I were to shoot, there was no way at 200 yards I was going to put a killing shot as far as dropping me in his tracks. I had to deal with another bear, which is probably a mate. I didn't want to kill him outright, which I probably wouldn't have had to follow him into that jungle. Deal with a crippled bear, and one that was looking out for him. And it was about time all this was happening, although once I heard the far distance the sound of an airplane. So I knew it was Wayne Smith coming, and that tipped the scales. It didn't take any shot, and I don't think I would have taken the shot anyway, because the last thing you want to do is leave a camp with a crippled grizzly bear around. I know. Unloading, I went back to camp, and we met Wayne Smith. He didn't fall in the water this time, and he flew us back to Valdez, dropped us off, got in our pickup, and drove home. Totally unsuccessful as far as our original mission. Totally unsuccessful as far as having a bright, glorious hunting trip, but we survived, and we got home. Our next Brooks Range adventure was with my specialty, which is Dall sheep, which is the premier meat of Alaskan wildlife. And we were fortunate enough that our mining camp sat in a place where we could look across the Koyukuk River into a mountain that had a cliff on one side and a lot of rolling tundra on the backside. And we could see it all from where we were at with a spotting scope, although it was well over a mile away. There happened to be a herd of 13 Dall sheep that lived in that mountain, a mountain we called Meat Market Mountain, because it was our meat market. Every Sunday, or sometimes every other Sunday, I would walk down to the river where we had a canoe stashed, canoe across the river, march up Meat Market Mountain early morning, because that was when they're out feeding. In daylight they would drop down into the cliffs and bed down so they had protection from the wolves. But I would sneak up there, pop a Dall ram, break it down as much as I could, put it in my pack, and back down the mountain, across the river in the canoe, back to the house, and then the time we scattered the chunks of meat all over the kitchen and break it down into usable chunks that Donna would prepare meals from for the next week. All very neat deal. Everything was going fine, except one time while we were right in the middle of this process in the kitchen, a plane flew over real low. I looked normally there were no planes around, so I was curious to see what that was. And it was a Fish and Game Super Cub, and he was doing a passover, turning around and going to land on our runway. Well, I panicked, naturally, because the Dall sheep season was open by any means. In fact, it wasn't a legal ram anyway, but I started scrambling, and Donna started scrambling, and we started throwing meat around, and finally they landed. And I said, hey, ditch all the meat you can, wipe all the blood off you can. I'll go out and hold them as long as I can. But we have to invite them in for a cup of coffee. That's just the way it is. So anyway, that all went on, and I stalled them out talking about hunting and fishing in the Brooks Range as long as I could. Then I invited them to the cabin, and everything was tidy. Donna had it all fixed up. She'd meet every place you could stuff it, I guess. The only thing I had, and I wiped the blood off the table and the counter. I noticed that there was blood running off the corner of the oven door, but I placed a chair so it wasn't obvious, and we got away with it. After a cup of coffee and some BS, playing around with Brandy, who was 1 year old and was scared to death of anybody because she'd never seen other people before in her cognizance. But anyway, we got through that, and they left, and we went ahead and finished processing the Doll sheep meat. But kind of a sideline of that story, one day there was oil activity on the North Slope, and they were drilling activity and exploring, basically. But occasionally a plane would fly up the Koyukuk and take related people up there. That was what the deal was, probably the lower end of the scale would fly on Queen Alaska and Bettles, and then the pilot where they lived, Shaky Shanahan, had a 180, and he would fly them from Bettles up to wherever they were going to go on the North Slope. Anyway, he stopped by one day and said, hey, you know, we talked, he's a nice guy, we talked a lot, and he said, you know, I really enjoy flying those old people up there. Every time I cross over where Wiseman, I tell them to be looking because I'm going to show them 13 Doll sheep on this mountainside, which we call Meat Market Mountain. And he said, you know, I told him there was 13. Then there was only 12. Next time I flew the guys out, I said, okay, I'm going to show you 12 sheep. By golly, there was only 11. And so forth. Anyway, he landed and BS'd with us at our camp, and I said I wouldn't know what the heck he was about. I never knew what, telling how many sheep there was. And then he looked me over and winked, and because I knew exactly what the hell was going on. Anyway, that was Shaky Shanahan, who eventually flew his 180 into a mountain, but he was one of the local characters around here. That's about all I can think of in relation to Meat Market Mountain. The protein we ate a lot of protein because we worked hard, and we ate a lot of meat, and we had a lot of meat. And it was around the 1st of September the caribou would come through by the tens of thousands, and we had plenty of caribou meat by then. But in the summertime, we lived off Meat Market Mountain. Well, this is the next version now of Donna and Jerry's adventures. It does not include Alaska. It takes place around the middle of the 1980s, and we were living in Ellensburg, Washington. That's about 60 miles from Moses Lake, which is close to a large body of water called the Potholes. Lots of islands, lots of bays, and a wonderful habitat for ducks. I'd been there quite a few times and established a presence there with a blind and what have you. At any rate, this time, Donna and I are going to go try our luck at duck hunting in the Potholes. So we left very early, got to the boat ramp before daylight. A couple other hunters were there fussing around, putting their boats in. Finally got everything in the water. In about 15 minutes on the water, with my camo boat, we reached the bay where I'd set up the blind previously. We put out 24 decoys, hid the camo boat, got in the blind just about the time daylight was coming over the sand dunes. Within an hour and a half or 2 hours, we had all the shooting we wanted. It was overcast, windy, a little bit fog, and the ducks were flying like crazy, so we shot them and put them in a pile in the blind. I didn't know if Donna had a duck stamp or not. Probably not. So I put 5 nice mallards in the boat, and we're wearing real heavy, bulky Carhartt coveralls. So he tied Donna's ankles with ropes, little ropes, and so the ducks wouldn't fall out, and we started floating her up. We got at least a dozen ducks stuffed down in her legs and down her stomach and her chest so that she could hardly walk, and we made it to the boat giggling and laughing and headed back to the boat dock. But just an entryway for allowing boats to get in and out of the water. It wasn't really a dock. As we pulled up, I thought, uh-oh, there's a game warden and 2 or 3 other guys standing around a pickup talking. And their heads turned when we pulled up, and Donna started on her pre-rehearsed carnival. She jumped out of the boat and screamed at me, "You rotten son of a bitch. Don't you ever ask me to go hunting with you again. In fact, give me the pickup keys. I need to get warmed up, and you need to put the boat in by yourself. I'm not helping you. So I handed her the keys, and she said, you're just damn lucky I don't drive away and leave you here. So we went around the back to started putting the boat together and up on the trailer. Got that done. I pulled it up, pulled it out of the way, and Donna's still ranting and raving in the pickup. And as I opened the door to talk to the guy, so I went over, and they'd been watching all the time. It was like quite a stage show for them. Anyway, I walked up to them, and we exchanged some pleasantries. And the guy said, well, I bet you don't take her duck hunting again. And I said, geez, I'll be lucky if I get to take her anywhere. She's hot. Yeah, she's hot. I said, well, anyway, we had success duck hunting, and I'm a duck hunter, and yeah, I've got 5 nice mallards laying in the bottom of the boat. I said to the game warden, you want to go take a look at them? And he said, son, you've got enough troubles on your mind right now. If I were you, I'd get the hell out of that pickup and leave before that pickup leaves without you. Well, I smiled, real happy about that. So I got in the pickup, where we went, probably 4 or 5 miles to the freeway, got out of the freeway, and first exit, took off, found a secluded place, and got out, and Donna unzipped her legs or her Carhartts, and down came ducks, started tumbling to the ground. We did have, as I recall, 12 extras there. So we stuffed them in the crossbody toolbox, laughed ourselves sick, and headed home in Badger Pocket, both of us knowing for the rest of the day we had a full day picking ducks and singeing them and preparing them for freezing, because the whole family loved fat mallard ducks. I know it was a good day on that extent, and it was a better day that we didn't get caught with a whole body full of dead ducks. Well, another chapter in the Alaskan Odyssey. This one occurred somewhere in the late 70s and is about a misguided and actual horrible duck hunt in Minnow Flats out of Fairbanks, Alaska. At any rate, it's a couple days before the duck season. Jim Giroux and I decided we would host a party of duck hunting out in Minnow Flats. We both had airplanes. We're both capable of flying several people out there. So 2 days before the season, we hopped on my Citabria GCBC and went out to look. Now, Jim's 65 horse champ on floats in Minnow Flats is over 50% water, so no problem finding him a place to land. But my wheels on big tires, it's a difficult story, because Minnow Flats has no airstrips, no sandbars, no normal places to land. But I've heard of somebody landing in tall grass in the mud flats that had a lot of tall grass. At this time of the year, it's brown and dried out. And so at any rate, they made enough passes to make a mat to land on. So I thought, well, I hadn't seen it happen, but let's take a look. We flew around, took about a half an hour from Fairbanks to Minnow. We got there and looked around and looking for something, and it looked right. I looked down, and one pond had a channel flowing through it, and a little tiny boat upside down in the grass. I had no idea how it got there. I thought, well, that's kind of where I want to go. And off to the side of that was a long stretch of marsh grass. I thought, well, Jim, we're going to give her a try. I came in first time real hot wheel landing, and so the tail would stay up and barely touch the ground, but I was doing 50 or 60, so far from landing, and mowed the grass down, and a lot of grass was chopped by the blade because it was 3 or 4 feet tall. Anyway, my idea was to lay the grass down. So anyway, we took her back up, did it again and again and again, probably 5 or 6 times. It was a nice looking spot there, but I really had no idea what it was, except I hadn't shown any water while I was doing the smash downs. So anyway, it's now or never. We're going to have a landing field or a dive in the mud. So I turned around, we landed again, and again I landed pretty hot to keep the tail up as long as I could, but eventually it came down, came to a stop, and was just fine. Just the ground was wet, but not spongy, and we didn't sink in. Of course, the grass laid down made a nice mat. So anyway, we had what we wanted and could land right next to the water. So I took off back to Fairbanks, loaded the camping gear, and our stuff in our 2 airplanes. Now, each airplane is only 2 plates, tandem seats, so we did what we could back in the middle landing. So, but we took what we could, went back to a middle landing, hauled it over in one spot we liked, and dumped everything off, went back to Fairbanks, called our 4 friends, said, hey, well, we'll meet you in a couple of them. We met up with a couple of them, and hey, tomorrow, 9 o'clock, be at the airport. Be there by the east ramp. And bring your sleeping bags, a gun, a lot of ammo, with each one of them an order on what to bring for food, steaks, beer, whiskey, in reality is all we needed, but we threw in a few potatoes too. Those guys are going to handle the groceries. Next morning we got everybody together, loaded all the stuff we couldn't sort out, and then we took out the back seat of our 2 airplanes. It's made more room. And we put 2 Blazo boxes filled with groceries and beer and seats for the person in the back seat. The Blazo boxes are wooden box holes, 2 5-gallon square gasoline cans. Oh, at any rate, and we loaded up each guy of our planes. Loaded up a guy in each of our planes and took off. Dropped them off in the middle flats, turned around, came back, picked up the other 2 guys, spent an hour setting up camp, make it real homey, and sitting in 2 coolers full of beer out and a whole damn row of whiskey bottles. And we always split into 2 or 3 groups to go find our spots to set up our blinds. I went directly over to where our little boat was, and Dennis Kronk was going to be my partner, so we made up our blind good as we could and went back to Blazo boxes for seats. We pushed up that little boat in the water, and it leaked in 2 or 3 places, so it wasn't too bad. I threw a couple empty beer cans in it so we could bail if we had to. And I'm back in camp, and then started to get a little hazy and evening out, so we got a big fire going, steaks and grills and beers. I'm telling you, it was fun. 6 of us, all are good friends and good acquaintances, and we had a lot of fun. And then but at daylight, or just before daylight, we were up, and I mean, we were staggering, but we were up, loading our guns and heading out for our 3 particular blinds. And we sat there probably for half an hour. Kronk and I it started getting light. Somebody started shooting, and ducks started flying, and for the next hour, we didn't do anything, but we did nothing but shoot ducks and take our boat out and retrieve them and come back and shoot more ducks. These were uneducated ducks. You didn't know enough to take off when they heard the shot, and they just kept flying around looking for somewhere safe. I had 12 decoys in front of our blinds that looked like a safe spot for them. So with all the shooting we could handle, but after about an hour it was blue-barred out. I mean, beautiful morning. All the ducks finally gave up. Then we gave up too. Kronk and I were sitting there looking at our pile of ducks, thinking how smart we are, and I heard an airplane. Looked over to the west, and 3/4 of a mile away I could see a blue and white Helio Courier taking off from the water. Heading straight for us, but climbing. Well, that's cool. A big 6-place Helio out duck hunting and got the job done, and now headed home. But that time I heard another plane. I looked back and I looked behind me, and here's a red and yellow Cessna 185. And I recognized the plane. It was an acquaintance of mine from Bettles. And he's on a downward glide path. I'm wondering what he did come clear from Bettles to go to Minnow Flats for something for. But hey, that's his business. At any rate, we're watching both the airplanes, and now unbelievable part is that I didn't have 5 other witnesses. I probably wouldn't be believing it myself, but when the Helio Courier got right straight above us, the 185 hit the Helio Courier's vertical stabilizer, and bam, a big clinking sound, and part of the tail fell off immediately. The 185 staggered, but he stayed in the air. I found out later he eventually made it back to Fairbanks with a busted float, but the Helio Courier came straight down. I mean, like a bullet. It didn't spin, it didn't twist, it came straight down. Here it is. Here comes the hard part. It landed right in my decoys. Nose first in the water, which was probably wasted chest high and plowed in the mud. And I mean, took me a minute to wrap my head around it. I looked over at Kronk, and he was doing amyl nitrate, and he was flopped over backwards. His stool fell off, and he's laying flat on his back, staring up at the sky, mumbling. He's not going to do me any good, so I got in my senses enough to drop my gun and go over and get in that little skiff. When I was there, I was using an army folding shovel for a paddle, and I paddled out to where the pilot side of the airplane. I looked in, and the water was about halfway up to the cockpit or a little more. There were 2 guys I could see. 3 people's head bobbing, just bobbing in the water, so I could tell that I couldn't get the door open because it was stuck, so I paddled around the other side, and that door was jammed pretty much open. I ripped and tore, and finally the whole damn door came off, and there were 2 guys up front. The pilot and the passenger had smashed into the steering yoke, so they're totally caved in. I knew they were gone. I looked in the back seat, and there was a woman whose face was half missing, and the black cloud lay floating. I mean, it was the worst thing I'd seen in my days. Anyway, I got back to my little boat and paddled there and poured cold beer on Kronk to get him focused a little bit, and ran to my airplane, got the radio, Call Fairbanks International. Explained there was a plane crash in Minnow Flats and 3 people to assist, and gave them the directions. And I said, you're going to need a chopper out here. Oh, please hurry. That was pretty much, they questioned me quite a bit about the location, but I said, I was able to zero in on it right away. So at any rate, I just went back and went to my blind. At that time, the other 4 guys had started to peel in. They had seen it from a distance, and they were up close. You could tell all of them that you don't want to go over to that plane. You don't want to go. Well, of course, Jim Giroux had to, so he did, but it was fine. And I said about half an hour, 45 minutes, I don't know, I heard a chopper, and a small, medium-sized chopper. And it came in and landed on the other side of this little pond we were at. The guys, and the other 2 guys got out, and the pilot stayed in, and I could see him. He was on the radio. He was calling back to Fairbanks, filling him in the situation, and the 2 guys hollered at me, hey, bring that boat over. So I did. They commandeered the little skiff, paddled me back to my side, and then they went to the plane and started packing bodies out. Took them over and laid them out on the slope of the beach on the other side and put the body bags on them. Loaded the three and got a little air, and the little helicopter and the helicopter took off, and those guys stayed there. But it was another half an hour. It wasn't even that much. And a big chopper came, a big military chopper from, I'm sure, Fort Wainwright, which ran out of Fairbanks. It landed, and they talked with the 2 guys, mumbled around a while, and 2 guys went over and put some rigging on the airplane. And the chopper went in the air. They hooked up the rigging, and so the big old chopper pulled that airplane out of the mud and drug it across the water over another bank where it sloped a little bit, and then they dropped the hook, and the helicopter landed again, and they rigged and re-rigged the wreckage. Chopper went up again, rehooked, lifted off, and took off. Didn't even have anything to hang on to. I mean, wasn't much left of the airplane, really, I guess. But anyway, it was a big chopper, and away they went. The other 2 guys had come in earlier, stayed again, another half an hour, I don't know, and the little chopper came back, picked them up. They waved and were gone. My little boat was on the wrong side of the pond, but anyway, they had it. It was like nothing had happened except the black lab was laying there. So one of you guys managed to get across the canal and brought the boat to me, and I went over with a shovel and buried the dog. We came back, and the 6 of us stand there going, holy cow. And I said, okay, boys, we're breaking camp and going home. We all went back to camp, broke it down, and Jim and I stuffed the whole damn camp in our 2 airplanes, except for their own personal gear, and flew back to Fairbanks. Dropped them off at the East Ramp, picked up 2, took them back to Fairbanks, went back, picked up 2 more. That was the end of Nightmare Duck Hunt. It was a rough one, but it was kind of felt was a story that needed to be told. Hopefully nobody's offended. And if anybody has any questions about it, I'll give you the names of all the 6 people that were there, 5, 6, including me. That's just the way it happened. Oh, by the way, at 20, we'd all put 20 on the table and a 6-pack of beer on who wouldn't fly away. And the guy with the most killed the most geese got the money. Well, Kronk and I didn't kill any geese, but Hipshot Roland did. He got a pretty good bunch of them. He made decoys out of piles of mud and sticks for their heads and necks. And he had a few geese, so he scooped up the money and said, oh, it was at $120. He gave 60 to Jim and 60 to me, and he said, that's for fuel, boys. That part turned out okay. I'm still friends with 3 of those guys because they're all that's left, but I'm still hoping they're all left. Still hoping they're all left. But that's the story. This is the adventures of Donna and Jerry, and not this time of their Alaskan escapades, but a couple of incidents that occurred in Montana while they were younger and living in that state. It does involve killing, and it involves a lot of hunting. That's what's going to happen. I would say this is probably about 1961, because we were living in Bozeman going to college. We came home to Harleton area for Thanksgiving. It was Thanksgiving, and we're going to have Thanksgiving at the ranch with Donna's family, which was all cool because I loved to be there. But anyway, while Donna's mother was dealing with a Thanksgiving dinner, her husband Till Sedgwick, Donna's brother Joe, and Donna went hunting, which was kind of a typical thing for Thanksgiving morning. and away we went, Till's old pickup, and we headed up to the McFarland White Ranch. At that time, you could hunt anywhere. There was no non-hunting areas. You went to hell ever you want, and that's what we were doing. And we pulled around back behind McFarland's place and found some aspen timber. And Till dropped Joe and I off to move through the timber to a big opening about a half a mile away where he and Donna would sit and ambush whatever we shook out of the bushes. So anyway, Joe and I jumped out and started angling through the trees, probably I'd say 50, 30 yards apart, and there were deer flushing in front of us. We could see that. And that's what our job was, to be dogs and chase the deer to Donna, really. It was a decent day, but the wind was blowing pretty hard into our face, but the deer had spotted us and they took off. Walking along, I couldn't believe my eyes, and I saw a little 2-point buck, what we call a forkhorn. And this was during the rut, by the way, laying down with his eyes were closed, and he was chewing his cud, and he was sleeping, but he'd been through the rut period that night. Evidently he was tired, and the wind was blowing, and he didn't hear us, so he didn't hear other deer leaving either, because he just lay there sleeping. And this, I can't validate this part, but I could validate it with Donna's brother Joe, except he probably wouldn't if he was alive today, because he and I didn't always see eye to eye. But at any rate, I walked up to this deer, slithered up to it, got within probably 5 feet of it, lay my cannon up against a tree, a birch or an aspen, and looked over at him and thought, darn, I'm going to take a shot here. So I thought, I'm going to grab him, and I'm standing straight behind him now, and I thought if I grab him by the ears, he'll probably slip away out of my grasp, and that'll be okay. At least I can say I grabbed a deer. So I went over, whammed, and I grabbed the deer right by the ears, and he came up. I got my arms crossed, and we're looking face to face, and he starts whacking away with his front legs. And I had a Levi jacket on and popped all the damn buttons right off. And so I thought, this thing isn't working right. So I hugged him closer, and we had breath-to-breath contact for a minute, and I started yelling, Joe, get your ass over here, get your ass over here. Now the deer is pounding on my back, and I'm always told that if a deer kicks you, it's going to be a bad thing. But it wasn't really that bad. I had control of this deer, but I wasn't liking the pounding, and Joe was getting over there quick enough, so I reached down and kicked the deer's back legs out from under him, as I did what always told me never to grab a deer by the back legs because he'll kick the snot out of you, but it didn't happen that way. I grabbed him, and I had him, and I pulled him up to that little, probably 3 to 4 inch tree that was right there, crossed his legs, and held him. I had him. I could have held him there for hours, because he couldn't do a damn thing. He was up on his front feet, but I had his back leg pinned and crossed, and he was done. Anyway, Joe finally came up and said, what the hell? I said, hey, Commander, I got this buck down now. You earmark him and castrate him. He grunted a little bit, pulled out his knife, and rolled that deer over a little bit so he'd get to him and castrate him, and earmarked him. I let him go, and away he went. That was it, my day. I mean, I had made my day. I had control over Donna's brother and made him do what I wanted to do, which was a one-shot deal. We'd exchanged blows enough time that this was a big deal for me. Anyway, I was pretty proud, poked my chest out, and of course I couldn't button my Levi jacket because he'd torn all the buttons off. Anyway, we kept marching down through the timber, and side by side, because we'd done all the securing a deer we could do. And we could see the blue pickup up in front of us. So we walked up to it, just got close, and I looked up, and a damn thing, not a huge, but a damn nice 5-point buck in the back of his pickup, tied up. Till always had a step-side pickup with a spare tire tied to the side, and he had the damn buck snubbed right up that spare tire with a rope around his neck. Okay, so now the deer got there was between Donna and Till telling me, because I didn't see it happen. But Donna shot that buck, but the one that we chased out during our little escapade, and the buck was well hard hit, but he didn't go down. He just kept standing there with his legs propped up. Till walked up to him with a little lariat rope, roped the son of a bitch around the neck, but by and by he actually got him by the horns and got dallied over the tire, and Donna pulled on the rope, and he got behind the deer with a stick and started whacking it until he beat him into the back of the pickup. And I went, oh shit, man, I thought I had a hell of a story to tell. Here they are, the 5-point buck tied in the back of Till's pickup, standing on all 4 feet. Till looks up at me and said, okay, Meringue, we got him in the back of the pickup. you cut his throat. I mean, it got real silent. Everybody looked at me and said, okay. I crawled in the back to pick up, whipped out my knife, grabbed that buck by the antlers, which were secured pretty well to that tire, so I didn't have much worry about that part. But he's still doing a lot of wobbling and wibbling and trying to kick me. But I did. I reached around and slashed his throat and put that myth to bed. So within the last half an hour, I'd grabbed a deer by the ears, had my friend castrate him, sliced a deer in the back of a pickup, and was pretty interested Thanksgiving for him. But you know, it gets more and more. We got in the pickup and took off. We got down to the base of what they call the round hill. Now, we've hunted that round hill a lot, but you always come up from the top of it and look down so we could shoot down into the bottom where the brush and trees were. Anyway, we worked out at the base of the round hill, and hell, there's probably 50, 60, 30, 40, I don't know how many deer, but there was a deer milling around everywhere. We had what we needed. We had a nice buck to make sausage out of, but one more is good too. So we're kind of eyeballing these deer, and they're milling around. Excuse me, I didn't know where these mountain deer came down to the brush for the rut, so they were not really familiar with everything that we did as hunters in the area. One of us looked over and saw a 3-point buck that was doing a major limp. He was trying to get on a doe, was having a hard time because his one leg didn't work right or something was wrong up front. Donna might remember, but somebody jumped out of the pickup and shot him because, hey, let's get that crippled deer, let's put him out of his misery. Down he went, and we went up there, and here was a 3-point buck from the mountains, not a local buck, but he had no front on his right side. He had no front leg, no front shoulder, and it was just skin. It was the way he was born. It was a 2.5-year-old deer born and bred in the mountains that came clear down here on 3 legs. Never had a 4th leg. Anyway, that was enough. He was still a hell of a nice piece of meat because he wasn't shot up, so he threw him in the back of the pickup of that big cut buck and went back to Thanksgiving meal, and that's the end of the story. Would you like to go one more mountain deer hunting story? Okay. We're still in college. We're in Bozeman. We came over the weekend because we needed some fresh deer meat around the house. And bullshitting with Till for a while, and he said, why don't you go over that little row of timber over behind the Lebo Ranch? And he explained what he was talking about. I knew right what he was talking about. I just had never been there before. Where was just south of what we call the Lebo Ranch of the C-Bar J, just a little south of a promontory called Squaw's Tit. Now, we don't call it that anymore. I'm sure we probably call it the Mammary Uprising or whatever. But it was a hill exactly like a woman's breast. And it was actually called Squaw's Tit on maps. I'm not sure it's that way anymore, but I'm hoping I'm not being politically incorrect and I'm going to shut somebody off, but that's just the way it was. Well, this row of timber on the hills above that bunch of wheat fields, to the south of this promontory mammary obstacle, or so unclear around the back on the road to Glenny's, and came up through C-Bar J to get up on top of that hill and overlook this little ridge of timber. Perfect place for a mule deer because a good place to spot and hide. And anyway, the first time I'd been there, so I didn't think Donna had either. We're cruising on the top of the ridge. We looked down and shit, there's 4 or 5 deer in the timber too far to shoot. So we climbed down, hid, pick up a little bit and climbed out and moved down toward him. It was a real sharp gut. When we got down there, I could see this buck. He was a nice buck. He was a 4-point. He was in the barrel and down he went. But like when we always did when we hunted, Don and I didn't go up together on a kill because one person covers the other person. So she kind of stayed backward on the side, a real steep little coulee, and I walked down where this buck went down. First thing you do when you knock down a nice buck is grab his antlers and take a look at him. Grabbed his antlers and he came right up with me, which I had already propped my gun up to a tree. I mean, I wasn't gun ready for him. But what I'd done, I'd shot him in the head, but I'd blown off his lower jaw and put him down. But he came up too, and he came up, he slung his head and threw my hand off, hooked my watch underneath my watch and flipped my watch right off. Didn't hurt me any, but that's how close he came to stab me with wrist anyway. And down the hill he went, straight down. He's wounded and he's going downhill. He's going to go downhill and then he's got to go back up the other side of where Donna was. I'm yelling at Donna. She had a .243 with a 4-power scope on it. Remember that very clearly. And down that buck went, down to the bottom and right back up, and I'm yelling at Donna, shoot, damn it, shoot. She said, I can't. All I can see is hair, and I don't know whose hair it is. This buck went right by her. She actually had to pull her barrel in off her shoulders so the buck wouldn't run into it, because he's like blinded and crazy, and he's in trouble and hurting. He doesn't pay attention to what's going on, but I didn't even know she was there, but he actually had to pull the gun to let him go by. Well, he got past her, I'd say 30 yards, and broke out of his scrub timber and turned, and whammo, she dropped him down right there, and that was it. That was our buck for the next 2 weeks of living in a hovel in Bozeman going to college. And that was our meet, so that was my second Montana mule deer adventure. And there was a hell of a lot more, but I think those two are worthy of putting down on print. Sometimes, after 30 or 40 years, memories get to where you're trying to make yourself or somebody look good. But when it comes to hunting, you always remember that every second, every bit of it. I remember the guns, the actual type of trees that were in a four-wheel drive pickup or not, and the whole thing. And when it came back to going to college, I can't remember the hell I was supposed to do in the creative literature. But when it came to hunting, we had it down. And maybe one of these stories will go into a couple of antelope hunts, which, man, I'll tell you, we had some dandies over in Atha's place there. And on the Sedgwick Ranch, too. We had some hellacious antelope hunts and took a lot of antelope meat out of that country. And anyway, that is... I'm going to shut her off now, but I want to tell you everything's okay. I'm shutting her down. This is Jerry again, and this is about a 10-day trip into the heart of the Brooks Range. So it may take a little longer than the other tapes that I've made, but it'll take me a while to go through the very complex hunt that this involves. And if you're at all shy about blood of wildlife, it's best that you turn this off now, because this was an extraordinary hunt, and a lot of animals were harvested during this trip. I had a hunter and his 14-year-old son that wanted to experience the depth of the Brook Range and experience as much wildlife as they could. And in the process, harvest 2 large doll sheep rams and see a bunch of other animals and a lot of country. So I took my Cessna 170B, flew up the North Fork of the Koyukuk, area that was somewhat familiar, 50 miles upriver from where it dumped into the Koyukuk itself, and dropped off a camp, which included, of course, a tent and all the cooking utensils, a 6-man rubber life raft, food, last a week, because I knew we'd have the option of eating wild meat up there too. And anyway, I dropped all these off, which was well over a 2.5-hour flight from Fairbanks. Another 2 hours getting back, so I already invested quite a bit of time and resources into it. Got to Fairbanks, picked up the 2 hunters, and my friend and pilot Don Blanc, as I needed somebody to fly the plane back after he dropped us off. So the next day again we headed north, flew to Bettles, gassed up, headed for the North Fork. Roughly, I said 50 miles from there. The material that I had dropped off, we landed, and Don was going to fly the 170 back with instructions, and in 10 days he was returned to Bettles, a village on the Koyukuk. There was an airstrip, and we were there to fly up and down the Kobuk of the North Fork until he found us and landed on a gravel bar and picked us up. All that was understood, and away he went. So went to work setting up camp. We had, of course, this was August, roughly 1975. At any rate, it was summer, so there was no darkness. Plenty of time to set up our camp, cook a nice meal, have a couple beers, talk about the hunt, get ready for the next morning. I was up early with a spotting scope and a cross. Now we were on an island, and I did for that reason, because I knew we were going to be there for a while with meat, and I was hoping that maybe it might discourage a bear, at least somewhat anyway. I found out that didn't work. But in the morning I started scoping across the river to the east, about a mile from the river, and there was a very long, sharp cliff that ran relatively flat-top mountain on the side. And right off the bat, on the first day get-go, I spotted 3 rams up on that cliff. Well, that was right up my alley, so I got the boys together, explained everything to them, had a big breakfast, loaded up the raft, crossed half of the river to get to the cliffside, and took off walking up the north, got off to the north. There up on the north side of the cliff, there was a sharp coulee gully, and it had lots of brush in it. We can get over there as quickly as possible. We'll be able to climb to the top of that flat top mountain and get above the sheep. That's what you want to do, get above them, because normally they always are looking down and they got cliffs to their back, so they're not concerned about their back. At any rate, we made it. We made it, and pretty soon, hell, I'd probably only walked about 300 or 400 yards, and we were over that coulee, and I could be undetected by the sheep, and I was sure that I had a mean with their eyes. They saw us, what was going on. They just didn't know enough to be worried, because they'd probably never seen a man before in their life, and at least other than natives. So up we went, and took us about 2 hours of walking to get up close to the top of the mountain. We brushed up the coulee, got near the top, and a female grizzly bear and 2 of her yearling, maybe 2-year-old cubs ran out behind her, straight up ahead of the hill, and turned and stopped and swung around and looked at us. And as my hunter, not the boy, the man, kneeled down with his rack of shell in his gun, I reached over and grabbed a hold of the barrel and pulled it up and said, "We're not here to shoot female bears, and we're not here to shoot cubs. That's the way it is. If you fire a shot, the trip is done." He looked at me. Okay, so we sat there a minute. I'm debating on what I'm going to do with these guys. And anyway, we had about 15 minutes. We got to the top, probably 100 yards back from the edge, and I told the two to sit down, load their rifles, and get ready. I'd be back for them in a couple minutes. So I laid my rifle down and crawled over the edge and looked down. I happened to have judged right. Although I had a pretty good idea where they were, I could have been a little off, but I wasn't. They were right directly below me, probably 40 yards, laying on a little plateau edge of the cliff, looking straight down at the bottom. I'm probably watching our camp, because I know they could see it. At any rate, I crawled back. Had to take the scope caps off. And with me low and slow, we crawled to the edge of the... And the 3 rams were still there, just looking straight down. So I told them, okay, to the adults. To the adult, I said, get ready. I'm going to take my 8-power binoculars. I'm going to pick out the biggest of the 3 rams. When I point that out, it is left, right, or center, you shoot. And I told the boy, as soon as he fires and the sheep rolls over, whack another one, because they're going to all be legal. So I swung around, got my glasses to look again to be able to pick up. Kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. I looked over, and all 3 rams were tipped over or falling off. One of them fell off the edge, and they were all hit, and they were all dying. And I thought, oh man, what a greedy guy. He looked at me and said, now we can go down and figure out which is real easy, which one the biggest one is. Well, there wasn't much I could say, except, call him an asshole. But we had 3 tags. All I didn't want to use mine up that early, but we had an early hunt as far as sheep season goes, and we were legal. So we shimmied down the back and forth and finally got down and cased all 3 shoulder mounts, cut off their horns, and started stripping meat. Took the back straps off all 3 and started on the loins. We loaded up all the meat we could carry, about 40 to 60 pounds of meat, and cape and 3 rams, a significant amount of meat. And it took us a while to figure out a way how to get down, but we finally did. Got to the edge of the cliff, and then the edge, and got down to the bottom, and had a leisurely stroll a mile to back to the raft, across the river, back in camp. Probably, oh boy, I don't know, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. While I got busy with the 3 hides. It takes quite a bit of time and energy to flesh out capes and prepare for the taxidermists, which turned their noses, their ears, and eyelids, and all that, and then salted them down the best I could. There wasn't a lot of extra weight there, and we had supper and everything was cool, so I was a bit unhappy how it turned out, but because I wanted the boy to shoot his own ram. But Father knows best, and yeah, a guy has to suck it up once in a while. So anyway, the next morning I got up and glassed around to see if there hadn't to be a wolf or wolverine up on those carcasses, and started finishing my work on the capes to make sure they were all properly secured, because it was going to be 8 or 9 days before we got out of the Brooks range, and then to a freezer or a taxidermist. So I fussed probably the best part of the day. We ate sheep liver and started supper time eating backstraps and onions, and we're feeling pretty good, and I went to bed. I heard some things that I really wasn't comfortable with, so I got up a quick look, took my gun, and we didn't have any trees on the island, so there was no place to hang the meat or perish meat out of reach, so the stuff needed to cool. Of course, you could put it in the river, but that meant, lo and behold, there was a bear on their side of the river had followed the noise and found the meat, and he was a young bear, probably 3 or 4-year-old grizzly. I thought, well, it shouldn't be a problem. I'm not going to have to shoot him. But the rustling around brought the other 2 guys up, and was kind of working my way around to see what this bear was doing. He hadn't touched anything yet, but he knew that it was there, and he was going to find out. But he wasn't real aggressive because he was too young to be aggressive. He'd been 10 or 12-year-old boy. He'd just come in and torn the camp up, eating the meat, and killed us or run us off or seen what happened before. But at any rate, I thought, okay, I'll take my 300 and I'll fire a shot right over his head and let it whistle through his ears, and maybe it'll get his attention. About ready to do that, and kaboom! The magnum of the hunter fired up. He caught the bear square in the front shoulders, high and down the bear went. Shit, I looked over at the kid. He just shrugged his shoulders. I told the guy, I said, you know, we were legal up on that mountain when you shot all 3 sheep, because I won't say you shot all 3 of them, because we had tags for them. But you're legal here, because I'm allowed to take grizzly bear and you're not. But I am, and this is not the bear I would have shot, and I hate having my license in the spring used up to a lot of bears, and a lot of them are big bears, and that's what I would have done. He was a hard guy to chastise, but I chastised him anyway. We had a dead grizzly bear in our camp and right next to our camp, and once again I got to earn my money by skinning the bear and fleshing the hide, which is quite a bit of grizzly bear, because again you have to split the ears, eyes, nose, all that fat when you dig out all the flesh and fat around the base of his claws and bones and get on the hide in 10 days before it gets to a freezer or taxidermy. It took me all day. I really wasn't comfortable with it because we were bringing 10 pounds of salt and 20 if you think you need it at this time. I did have 20 pounds, but it takes a lot of salt. So I salted him down, and then I spread him out and staked him so the sunlight would help me in the drying process, because I needed to get that hide dry. That's what the salt was for, to pull the moisture out. At any rate, it took me the rest of the day and even part of the next day to get all that done. Finally, the next day, I rolled the hide up, and we loaded the sheep capes and horns and camp. And probably at that point 20 pounds of prime Dall sheep meat, which was which by the way is, other than 1st of September kill young bull caribou, is the best meat there is in Alaska. Anyway, we got all loaded, and we got down the North Fork of the Koyukuk, and I figured we still had about 7 or 6 days left, and I knew we'd run into some stuff on the way down. But I didn't want to get down there too early because they'd paid me for 10 days, and I figured 10 or 12 mile day was about what we were going to do. So down the river we went. The river became a little bigger as the creeks came into it. Just a nice drift to keep the paddling. For paddles, we had lost both paddles. And this was a big accident, not the kids' fault, but anyway, the hunters had carved out a paddle out of driftwood, which is pretty good, by the way. I've got a picture of it, and the shovel with a short handle, so we had all the paddles we needed in that river, so we drifted about 10 miles. I saw a nice spot, so we pulled out and set up camp. We didn't put up a tent or anything because it was beautiful. We set up a camp by setting up the stove, starting fires, and cooked some more sheep meat and onions and some dehydrated potatoes and a couple more beers. And eventually we drifted off, and next morning we took off again. And I would say we were probably 2 hours into the float, and a cow moose was swimming the river right ahead of us. I said, hey, this will be an experience for the kids. So man, I dug my paddle, and so did the hunter, and we got up to that moose before she crossed the river. And I thought it'd be cool. Maybe I'll even put a rope on her and let her pull us around a little bit. About that time, same guy, same gun, boom. I shot that cow moose while she was swimming right in the head. And again, what am I going to say? You know, I'm not illegal, because at that time in the 70s, you could shoot any moose you saw, especially north of the Yukon. But at any rate, I did my chastising, but to no avail. Put a rope on the moose's head before it got too far into the water and damn near to the shore anyway, and we towed it over to the shore, got behind it and drug her up out of the water, where I went and told him I'll start hauling stuff out. We're camping right here. And I went to cutting on the moose and carved off all the best pieces of meat I could find, and then the 6-man raft was getting kind of heavy because we had a lot of stuff in it, so I figured we could put maybe another 100 pounds of meat in it, and I set off I'd set up a drying rack and a smoking rack so we could dry some of it, because I knew the fresh meat wouldn't last until we got out of here. So that's what we did. I kept the fire going between the three of us. We kept the fire going all night and smoke going in the morning. I don't know, roughly 9 o'clock or so. The meat wasn't dried or smoked, but it was, at least I'd hoped it turned out that it wouldn't spoil before we got out of there. So, but we still left a hell of a lot of meat on the moose, and that's the first time that we really broke a law, other than me kind of BSing the game warden about who shot what. But wanton waste of meat is a law, and it's a good law. You should always pack out the meat that you take down. You don't just cut off the antlers and leave behind the animal. Well, this is one that didn't have any antlers, but we still left a lot of meat there for the wolves. And one thing about the meat, I'm not justifying it, but wolves on Wolverine would clean this up within 2 or 3 days, maybe 4. But anyway, we left with a heavy raft, another 100 pounds of moose meat the next morning, and we went down the river, and I didn't keep track of the days as far as the 10 days goes, but I think we're getting pretty close to about 7 of them anyway. I figured we're cool. We'll get down to Bettles more than a day before my partner shows up with my 170, and we went and at least 10 or 12 miles, and lo and behold, some of this kind of hard to believe unless you were there, but in the 70s there were animals everywhere. There was a big gray wolf swimming the river right in front of us. And now one of the most spectacular parts of the trip occurred. When the wolf pulled out of the river, we got to where it went and took off as well. We had about a 10-foot bank to crawl up. And you got up on top of this bank, and now there was heavy brush for about another 20 feet, and dropped off another 6 feet because of the creek up there had flowed into it in the spring, and it flowed heavy because there was a big mountain and there was a big like alluvial plain right in front of us, a sand and light gravel. We got up on top of this brush and looked over this little bank. Alluvial plain was scattered, a bunch of willows, and there just once in a while. Other than that, there wasn't anything. It was a pretty flat area, and the wolf was just hauling it, man. He knew he something wasn't right. I mean, the moose and the sheep, they didn't understand people. Wolf evidently pursued by airplanes or something, and he was in motoring, as I'd have a lot of it. I'd had experience with predator calls and was successful calling in black bears and some coyotes, but I had very little luck with wolves, even when I saw them before they saw me, and was camoed in where they couldn't see me. I never had a wolf come to me. Now, if you read this whole set of tapes, you know that my 1-year-old daughter called a wolf right into our mining camp, and my wife shot it, but it was never called a wolf. But I had never called a wolf, and she never did, of course, by blowing on the thing, because it wasn't one of the toys she had back in the Berks Range. But anyway, what the hell, you know. So I told the dad, I said, we all have our guns, and out. Naturally, I told him, you keep down and don't stick your goddamn head up. The kid I had a hold of him by the blue down jacket I had on, pushed down with his face in the brush and pulled out my call. I blew a long-range snowshoe hare distress call and stopped that wolf in his tracks. Well, it turned out the wolf was very, very old. He had his teeth were shot this summer, and he was mangy, so he was in rough shape and would never made the winter. At any rate, that teased him. He slammed on the brakes, turned around, and I gave a couple little squeaks, not a call, but a couple squeaks. And he turned on that and came straight at us. Now, this guy is about 200 yards off, so I figured, okay, I got my head up a little bit, and I'm watching. I finally got about half the distance, and I ducked down. I grabbed a hold of the kid by the shoulders and said, put your safety off and be ready. And I timed it perfectly on it. Part of it was by accident, but part of it was I knew the distance, and I knew how fast he was traveling. About the time I thought he'd hit the bank and come up, I jerked the kid up, and the wolf came right up over the top of the bank. Went to a screaming halt about 30 feet from us, maybe 20 feet from us, and looked at us, and this kid had his gun aimed right at him. And I said, shoot, and the wolf just spun him spun on himself and took off running again out across the big plain. He was running at an angle, not straight away, but not broadside, but at an angle. And he was out, I don't know, because it was an angle, and he was out, and I know, because I paced it off at 125 yards. He was hauling as fast as the kid touched off the 243, and that wolf just piled up. What a shot. I mean, I couldn't have made that shot, but I knew the kid did it and earned his spurs on that one shot from all the times his dad had taken shots away from him, and they folded that wolf up. So we went down there, and I took a look at him and said, fellas, I'll skin him out, but his hide isn't worth $10. It's not worth nothing, and I won't make a trophy for you, but the head will. So I caped it out, just his head, and cut the skull loose, and we took the cape just below the neck and head, and then went back to our raft, drifted about a half mile more until I found a nice campsite with a creek coming out of it. I fleshed out the wolf's head, fleshed out his skull. Now when you take a bear or any other carnivore, to measure them, for the record book, you push them up against a wall, push the nose up against the wall and measure how long the skull is. Then you push it sideways and measure sideways at its widest point. And that was green, so it wouldn't count because it had to set for 60 days. But that wolf turned out to be number 2 in the world record book as far as the size of the skull goes, which was really made me feel good for this kid, because all 3 of the sheep were good ones, real good ones. One was pretty good, the other one was a 3 curl, but none of them are anywhere near the record books. They were just nice full curl mounts. But this wolf was special, and I knew the dad would take the cape and have it mounted, and I told him how to do it. The next day, my 170 flew over and dipped a wing, and headed for the gravel bar about a half a mile down the river. 2 loads and everything we had today, and bettles, and it's the end of an adventure, and a wonderful adventure it was. And this is the end of the CD, and I thank you very much, and I certainly apologize for the roughness of the way that I've presented this. I've made it as truthful and as honest as I could, but I've made quite a few bumbles and fumbles, but I hope you'll take that into consideration, that I'm an 83-year-old guy, and I'm just trying to get by. Thanks again. Bye-bye.